Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again the next 60 pages of Masters of War. We're going to be continuing with Reagan's wars. This is Latin America and U.S. aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years. It's a book by Clara Neto. So we're going to be continuing with Reagan's wars, and then we're going to talk about Panama, quote unquote, dead man walking. This book describes the U.S. interventions in Central America and South America, Latin America. We discussed yesterday the two countries of Nicaragua and El Salvador. In this campaign, the U.S. government, committed mass murder against the, peasants of Nicaragua. It was a terrorist organization that, Ronald Reagan employed for his vicious campaign of terror against the campesinos of Nicaragua. The organization was initially thought to be overthrowing the government, but it was a failure. Reagan was a failed president. Everyone knows Reagan was an abysmal failure as a president, and he was just a vindictive, vengeful, white, murderous butcher. That's ultimately what amounts. And the Contras were just, locally murdering people. They were just locally murdering peasants rather than conduct any military campaign of any real value. They just locally murdered the peasants of Nicaragua. There was no real systematic goal of attacking military establishments. They were just unable to do so. They were not well equipped. They were not well trained. And Washington just used it to commit murder against the Hispanic people. And that's Washington's approach. They just are just murderous butchers of Hispanics and just in general, third world people. They're murderous butchers of the third world. And, we're talking about, Nicaragua and their murderous butchery against the Hispanic people of Nicaragua. So we went through all of the different things in Nicaragua, and we'll get through it. We'll get to it in our little, background. But, we want to just, ensure that you understand that the U.S. government is, a group of gun-violent, murderous white butchers. They are murderous, gun-violent mafia butchers. That's what they are, and that's how they, do their actions. The Nicaraguan story includes the Sandinistas, all of the different, treaties that the Sandinistas were begging the United States to agree to. We even also included the International Court of Justice, and the Americans found guilty at the International Court of Justice. They didn't heed the organization because they're gun-violent, white murderous butchers, right? I mean, when Washington gets, ascribed guilt at any International Court of Justice, they say that this is not white justice. This is, third world justice, because they're racist, murderous white butchers. They want to murder people in third world and get away with it. And that's Washington's approach to everything. So we had the Sandino treaties, the SAPOA Accords, the Esquipulas, Accords, all of these things that Reagan was offered to, agree to. He disagreed. He didn't agree. In fact, when the Accords, the SAPOA Accords, were signed by the Contras, Reagan blasted the Contra political leadership and called Calero a crazy man, a deranged lunatic. And he said that, America will never agree to such a peace initiative by the Contra political leadership. I mean, Reagan was a butcher, a racist, murderous white butcher, similar to their other presidents like Jimmy Carter, racist, murderous, white, anti-Hispanic butcher. That's ultimately what all of these interventions in Latin America show, that the American government are racist, anti-Hispanic, murderous, white butchers. So that's it for Nicaragua. The next discussion was El Salvador. We discussed El Salvador at length. It was a bloodbath. Reagan, followed up with Carter's war. Carter had committed enough atrocities in El Salvador. There's enough books out there to discuss Carter's, El Salvadoran atrocities. So after Carter's war of, murderous butchery in El Salvador and Central America, we came to Reagan, who just followed that up with a slightly more, murderous approach. He, armed the rebels, armed the, government of El Salvador with much more, weapons. He gave, more, room for murder. He didn't criticize any of the human rights abuses all of that stuff. I mean, both presidents committed major murderous butchery in El Salvador, except Carter was a better propagandist than Reagan. That's all. I mean, Reagan was just an honest person who is a murderous white butcher, whereas Carter was a secretive murderous white butcher. That's the difference. That's the American presidents. Democrats versus Republicans. They're all one thing, murderous white butchers. The Democrats are more secretive about their murderous butchery, and the Republicans are much more open about it. That is my discussion of it. So the mass murder campaign in El Salvador included rapes, mutilations, torture, imprisonment, arbitrary detention, all sorts of criminal actions by the U.S. government thugs. They are, thugs that committed these actions. The U.S. government paid for, funded, and allowed all sorts of murderous butchery to occur. Mutilations were commonplace. Arms were cut off. They provide electrocution and drowning hardware to the El Salvadoran government to allow for appropriate torture of liberalists and third world, scholars, leftists. All political leftists were imprisoned and murdered by the El Salvadoran government under the instructions of President Carter and Reagan. These were all murdered by the U.S. government. Murderous white mafia butchers. So we're going to start with our background. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to make a slight adjustment to the screen because I think it's going to be just a little too high. I think, that's much better. We can see, much more there. That's perfect. Okay, so Masters of War, Latin America and U.S. Aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years by Clara Neto. Please download the book at the description section. It's, the Google Drive link is discussed in the description section. Please download the book because it is a good book to read, and it is something that certainly can be, learned from. And reading and watching presentations is the best way to understand things. We discussed the murderous white American butchers, Ronald Reagan, Alexander Haig, and Jean Kirkpatrick in their genocidal campaign in Central America. These white murderous butchers conducted campaigns of terror, torture, rape, mutilation in the countries of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and subverted the democratic leader of Costa Rica with police repression and terror. Let us discuss Nicaragua. The Sandinistas took power from Somoza in 1979, and as soon as coming to power, the U.S. elected the gun-violent, murderous white butcher Ronald Reagan into power. He was a Central American mass murderer and was responsible for the white butcher results in Nicaragua. He ordered the Contras, a terrorist organization funded by the U.S. congressional white butchers, to commit wide-scale murder, torture, rape, and bombings in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas' democratic government. The U.S. murderous white butchers, including Reagan, supplied hundreds and millions of dollars to the Contras to conduct a butcher campaign against the Hispanic people of Nicaragua. At first, Reagan painted this as a military operation. When one studies the actual results, one finds the Contras were responsible for murdering Hispanic peasants and local murders and tortures, and did not do any successful action against the Sandinistas military. The U.S. gun-violent murderous white butcher Reagan and the U.S. mafia white murderous Congress butchers of Congress hit the international outrage and Reagan's war of aggression against Nicaragua. There was no discussion about Reagan's criminal aggression against the Sandinistas, which was entrenched in American lies, deceit, and propaganda, and murderous butchery. A few incidents deserve mentions, including the Phantasma incident in which 35 teachers of the Sandinistas education program were brutally murdered by the Contras. Reagan called this a great act. We also can talk about Reagan's militaristic obsession and lack of interest in diplomatic discussions with the Sandinistas. He absolutely refused all peaceful means to resolve the dispute with the Sandinistas, as is a common trait of American white murderous butchers of the U.S. government. He was asked to accept the Contadora peace treaties established by multiple countries and endorsed by Mexico, in which terms of a ceasefire and contra-halt to terrorism was detailed. He refused after the Sandinistas accepted the proposal and refused a peaceful solution because he is a gun-violent, white murderous American butcher. The Roman Catholic murderous European fascist church, including its Pope John Paul II, criticized the Sandinista regime for its defense of its people and endorsed the American puppet archbishops, including Obanda and Vega, who were well connected with Washington. This gave no room for the Sandinistas or the Nicaraguan people to come to a peaceful settlement because of the gun-violent European and American fascist white butchers. Reagan's war collapsed as the Contras were a failure. They were supposed to commit acts against the Sandinista military, but instead became obsessed with murdering Hispanic peasants, as any U.S. government-funded terrorist action ends up being. The Contras began peace negotiations, although the Sandinistas were very successful in derailing the Contra morale. The Sandinistas made great concessions with the Contras in 1988 and were ready to sign the SAPOA Accords. Reagan was still in the White House and tried to sabotage SAPOA with tirades against Clara, the political leadership of the Contras, over Costa Rican radio stations. He was enraged with signing of this agreement, and his domestic American thugs of the Cuban exiles and the Nicaraguan exiles bitterly campaigned against SAPOA. The peace process was derailed by Reagan's bitter white racist, murderous deceit and lies, and propaganda harassment of the Contra political leadership. Now we talk about El Salvador, which was Reagan's campaign of mass murder against the Salvadoran people. This was the FMLN, which was the Salvadoran rebels fighting the ruthless dictatorship of Colonel Jaime Abdul Gutierrez, which was worse than Carter's human rights slaughter dictatorship of General Humberto Romero. There was mass murder, extermination of peasants, machine gun of civilians, bombing of civilian areas, and disappearances and mutilations, including eviscerations of bowel and amputations, as well as electrocution and drowning torture. This was all provided and funded by the U.S. Congress and Reagan. We remember Pierre Trudeau, the Canadian leader who backed Reagan in his war of Hispanic slaughter in El Salvador and had conversations with the Canadian presidential palace. We also know the international outrage against Reagan's brutal war against the El Salvadoran people and his funding received by U.S. Congress. Many international bodies condemned Reagan's war. Reagan is in total a murderous white American gun violent butcher and deceitful fraud liar of the U.S. government, and similar to all of their presidents. So let's get started. We're gonna, get started. I'm gonna just, make a little adjustment here so that we get a little more room for me to, put the book down. So we're going to from Reagan's Wars, page 372. We're gonna start, and then we're gonna go into Panama. We won't be able to finish Panama. It'll be 4 hours then. I can't sit down. I have work and all that stuff. So the People's War. In spite of massive United States military aid, the Salvadoran army did not have the ability to defeat the guerrillas, according to a Pentagon document leaked to the press in February 1981. Defense Secretary Weinberger declared that this was the one man's basically inaccurate view of the El Salvadoran army. At that point, the FMLN had 8 military fronts and controlled an extensive strip of land near the Honduran border and areas around the 4 great volcanoes. The army showed signs of demoralization because of the continuous high casualties inflicted by the guerrillas. The map published by Newsweek in March showed FMLN offensives throughout the country. Most of the attacks were on economic targets. The FMLN blew up bridges and electrical networks, set fire to factories and export warehouses, buses, trucks, and transportation facilities, and blockaded highways to stop commercial transport. What angered the government, the armed forces in Washington, most were the guerrilla attacks on military objectives. In January 1982, in an attack on the Ilopango Air Base, the country's most important air base used by the United States to support its operations against Nicaragua, half the Air Force was destroyed. According to official sources, the guerrillas, attacking at dawn with mortars, dynamite, and machine guns, destroyed 6 airplanes, as well as 6 of the 14 Huey helicopters supplied by United States, and seriously damaged 11 other planes. According to the guerrillas, they destroyed 20 planes. 9 people died. Ilopango was turned into an inferno. Time reported after the demolition by dynamite of the Puente de Oro Bridge over the Lempa River a year earlier, it was the country's most important bridge because it united East and West. The attack on the Ilopango base was the most devastating blow of the war. It was also the most destructive of the armed forces' image and unity, since base personalized help. Since base personnel helped the guerrillas. The day after the Ilopango attack, the FMLN opened a series of offensive and ambushes against the army in Usulután department, in which there were 34 casualties. The army responded by bombing the countryside and mounting raids in the cities. At Nueva Trinidad, it assassinated 150 civilians and killed 32 more in San Antonio Abad, a San Salvadoran neighborhood. Students and workers comprised most of the dead, and many of the women were raped before they were killed. In January 1982, Reagan presented Congress with his first certification of the human rights situation in El Salvador, quote unquote, which stated that the situation had, quote unquote, improved. It claimed the number of dead was down, that the 6 soldiers responsible for the murder of the 4 nuns had been arrested and sentenced, and that agrarian reform and the democratic process, quote unquote, preparations for the election and the Constitutional Assembly were progressing. He recognized, however, that the problems were far from resolved. The same week, in a 297-page report, America's Watch and the ACLU denounced the continuing political assassinations, some 200 a week, and the tortures and disappearances at the hands of the Salvadoran security forces. A month earlier, the horrendous El Mozote massacre had occurred. Washington blamed the guerrillas for these political crimes. Amnesty International, the World Council of Churches, the Russell Tribunal, the El Salvador Archdiocese Office of Judicial Assistance, journalists, and independent observers unanimously rejected Reagan's certification, and members of Congress introduced a resolution to declare it null and void. It did not pass. The devastating guerrilla attack on the Ilopango base gave Reagan room to breathe. The guerrilla advance placed Congress in a great dilemma. If it denied military aid to El Salvador based on the human rights situation, it could be guilty of allowing the army to be defeated. It approved $66 million in emergency military aid, half of what Reagan requested. The possibility of a military victory, such as one dreamed up by the ardent Mr. Haig, grew more unachievable every day. Duarte publicly admitted that the war was being lost. After Reagan's certification, the FMLN sent him a letter to remind him that the Salvadoran people had been under military rule for the past 50 years and that their fight was against the dictatorship supported by the United States, which was responsible for the murder of 30,000 Salvadorans and the murder of 4 American nuns in the past 2 years. It pointed out that his impression of the Salvadoran conflict as a confrontation with the Soviet Union was totally divorced from reality, and that the soon-to-be-held elections for the Constitutional Assembly were a quote-unquote farce, since there could be no guarantees of a democratic process in the middle of indiscriminate repression. It, quote, respectfully asked him to change his policies. The advent of democracy. In the midst of military, paramilitary, and guerrilla violence and common crimes, preparation continued for the election of the Constitutional Assembly. Reagan saw a need to demonstrate democratic progress in El Salvador in order to break down congressional resistance to military aid. Defense Minister General Garcia guaranteed that the election would be held, even if it took place in the midst of bullets, and that the armed forces would respect the results, whatever they are. During this pre-election period, the human rights situation was crucial for Duarte and Washington. They had to demonstrate a climate of peace and show that there would be guarantees that in fact did not exist. Thus, the report of the murder of Clara Neto, of 4 journalists, a Dutch television crew, 11 days before the election, threw both governments into a panic. The Minister of Defense hastened to assure the press in a plainly worded statement that the incident had occurred in a crossfire between army and guerrilla lines. Washington made the same claim based on an investigation by its embassy in San Salvador. Shortly thereafter, anonymous witnesses testified that the journalist had been assassinated by an army patrol. The election for the Constitutional Assembly was held on March 28, 1982, with the country at war after 2 years under a state of siege without constitutional guarantees, with the opposition press closed or self-censored, and the people traumatized by official and paramilitary violence. There were 200 political murders a week and more than 30,000 deaths. Of the 60 governments who had been invited, only 9 sent observers. Few wished to become involved in a process that awakened so much doubt. Few would support this government to please Washington. The junta sent conditions so it could control the election. Votes were stamped on identification cards in indelible ink. The ballots and ballot boxes were transparent and numbered so that it would be possible to see who voted. Not voting is treason, warned the Minister of Defense. Some 700 foreign journalists, most of them from the United States, covered this event, but few knew the complex realities of the country. They reported that the people participated in massive numbers, and they published photos showing the long lines of campesinos waiting to vote. Their characterization of the election as free, democratic, and legitimate refuted reality. The United States openly intervened in the peace process with advisors and $1 million contributions to help Duarte's Christian Democrats. The major opposition force, the FDR, had not participated because there had not been any of the necessary guarantees. The United States press failed to mention these facts. FDR leader Guillermo Ungo spoke from his exile in Mexico, asserting that he had not participated because it would have been suicide to do so. When these elections had first been discussed 2 years earlier, the armed forces published a list of 130 traitors whom they considered responsible for subversions and announced that they would be tirelessly persecuted. The list included the names of all the FDR leaders. The massive turnout for the election, noted by the foreign press, was enthusiastically exploited by Reagan and Duarte. Lines of people waiting for their turn to vote were exactly the image they needed. It was the triumph of democracy, quote unquote. The turnout exceeded all estimates, said Reagan and Haig. Ambassador Dean Hinton spoke of a defeat for the guerrillas, who asked people to abstain. There was evidently not much popular support for the insurgency, he said. The Christian Democrats won a majority of 35% of the votes and 24 of the 60 assembly seats, and the ultra-rightist party Arena, formed by Robert D. Aubison, captured 16 seats. The result dampened the enthusiasm of Reagan and Duarte for the electoral success, for the assembly was now in the hands of the far right. Arena allied itself with the Partido de Conciliación Nacional, National Conciliation Party, PCN, party of the military, to achieve a majority. To Aubison, who had been accused of being the head of the death squads, and whom former Ambassador Robert White called a psychopathic killer, quote unquote, and architect of Monsignor Romero's assassination, was elected assembly president and was in a position to be chosen provisional president of the republic. Reagan sent his administration ambassador at large, General Vernon Walters, to warn the military and the deputies that if Aubison was elected president, the United States would cut all aid to El Salvador. Agitated and bitter negotiations among deputies, political parties, and the military to choose a provisional president lasted almost a month under pressure and threats from Ambassador Dean Hinton and Reagan's envoys. Several times the assembly was unable to meet for lack of quorum. Finally, among shouts and applause, on April 10, 1982, Alvaro Magana, president of the National Mortgage Bank for 17 years, was elected by a majority of 36 votes with the help of the Christian Democrats and the military. Arena candidate Hugo Barrera garnered 17 votes. After 3 years of a war that was virtually financed by the United States, El Salvador now had a new president, Alvaro Magana, 1982 to 1984, with a government dominated by the extreme right and the old military command still intact. General Garcia, the Minister of Defense, and Colonel Vivez Casanova, commander of the National Guard, who were responsible for the dirty war, remained solidly ensconced in their posts. Members of Arena were nominated for the 4 most important ministries. Another 4 were to be filled by nominees suggested by the armed forces. and the three positions left for the Christian Democrats had neither political nor social importance. The new Arena Minister of Agriculture did away with agrarian reform. The new 1983 Constitution did not mention the subject. On the contrary, it emphasized that the obligation to the state to respect and guarantee private property. Charles Percy, chair of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, warned not one penny will go to the government of El Salvador if agrarian reform was stopped. Magana launched a publicity campaign to quote unquote show the world, he declared, that land distribution continued. At a ceremony in the presidential palace, he handed out land titles to campesinos, flanked by high-ranking military officers. It's pure theater, commented a high Salvadoran official scornfully. Under Magana's weak government, the war continued with greater intensity. Repression was even more brutal, and the number of political murders kept rising. Of the 30,000 assassinations so far, 700 were Christian Democrats. The death squads continued killing, and Archbishop Rivera y Damas kept denouncing the killings, tortures, and disappearances of his homilies, holding the forces of order responsible. Obviously, they are free to kidnap and murder civilians in broad daylight with no fear of punishment by the authorities, he said. In August, he blamed them for the 270 political murders in the previous 2 weeks. The same month, Magana named a peace commission to explore the possibilities of negotiating with the guerrillas. The military opposed it. At the end of June 1982, Reagan presented Congress with a second certification on the human rights situation in El Salvador, again claiming progress. Enders defended the report to Congress, maintaining that there were fewer dead, lands were being distributed, the government was in control of the armed forces, and the country held free democratic elections. But he recognized that it has a long way to go to achieve full success. Democratic Representative Jerry Studs accused him of using ludicrously inadequate statistics, and with 80 other representatives, he introduced a resolution declaring Reagan's certification null and void. He did not win a majority. The House approved $61 million in military aid. Losing the war, question mark. Guerrilla advances and the Salvadoran army's poor performance worried and irritated the State Department and the Pentagon, since the army was heavily supported by the United States. They blamed the Minister of Defense, General Garcia, for his incompetence in not following the instructions of the Green Berets, who had planned the operation and directed the counterinsurgent fight, at times participating. Washington agreed he must go. In addition, the United States needed to show evidence of progress in human rights. It was made uncomfortable by the fact that the government had not captured those responsible for the assassination of American citizens, and that Second Lieutenant Rodolfo Isidoro Lopez Cibrian, the man accused of masterminding the Sheraton Hotel murders, had been at large for the last year and a half. The courts released him for lack of evidence. Arrest and conviction for these murders was a condition Congress imposed before it would approve military aid to El Salvador. After the election, the army asked FMLN to give up its weapons, but the FMLN responded with a series of attacks in Morazan department. In 5 days, it inflicted 200 casualties on the army and took 2 cities, which it later abandoned. The army bombed them with recently acquired Dragonfly jets. Later that month, the FMLN shot down an army helicopter carrying the Vice Minister of Defense, Colonel Adolfo Castillo, and the Morazan commander who died in the accident. The guerrillas captured Castillo, whom they freed after 2 years in exchange for a release of a group of political prisoners. The FMLN and the FDR launched a double offensive, political and military, to force the government to negotiate peace. The FDR proposed a direct and unconditional negotiation to end the war and reduce tensions in Central America. In the meantime, the FMLN was carrying out extensive attacks in the north and east of the country, inflicting 189 casualties on the army and taking 90 prisoners of war. At a press conference in Mexico, FDR leader Guillermo Ungo and Ana Guadalupe Martinez of the FMLN, both exiled in that country, stated that the government had not responded to their peace proposals. Legislative Assembly President Orbison warned that he would not allow discussions or negotiations with the guerrillas. The State Department dismissed the FDR proposal as cosmetic. The defeat of the guerrillas dealt the army and accumulated and caused profound malaise and divisions within the armed forces. Some wanted to continue the war, others wanted to arrive at an agreement that would end the conflict. They were irritated by the High Command's poor performance. The internal crisis exploded when the Minister of Defense removed the star commander of the counterinsurgency, Colonel Sigfredo Ochoa, from command of the battalions in Cabinet Department. He was appointed military attaché to Uruguay to get him out of the way, since he had been accused of murdering a sacristan, and he refused to obey the order. Ochoa demanded that the minister resign and accused him of treason and prolonging the war without offering other choices. He told Magana to keep his pants on and stop letting himself be manipulated by the minister. He warned that he would not give in until General Garcia resigned. The rebel radio station Radio Vencemeros reported this is a fight among the murderers of the fascist high command. The crisis lasted 3 months. It ended when Garcia, under pressure from the high command, resigned. Vidas Casanova, commander of the National Guard, was named Minister of Defense. In 1983, Reagan's Central American policy sprung a leak. They were failing in Nicaragua and El Salvador, and they were severely criticized at home and abroad by allied and friendly governments. Reagan's got a war on 2 fronts, one in Washington and the other in El Salvador, and he's losing on both, commented a congressman. The insurgents continued their double offensive. The guerrillas kept on attacking the army, causing high casualties and defeats, while the FDR-FMLN continued to insist on negotiation. In March 1983, they presented a new peace proposal. They asked the government for a consensus group to include the guerrillas and their moderate allies, and they demanded that the government dismantle the 10,000-strong security forces, move on economic reforms, including agrarian reforms, and make agreements with the guerrillas that would provide guarantees for future elections. We are not so stupid as to participate in the elections and wind up in a cemetery, noted Ungo. In June, they proposed another 5-point plan. The country must reclaim its sovereignty and carry out a direct and unconditional dialogue with the parties in conflict. Since the proposed criticized the growing intervention of the United States, since it prevented the country from achieving peace, justice, and independence, it declared that no accord could succeed without participation by the FDR, FMLN, and asked third parties for their good offices during the peace process. In March 1983, Reagan defended his Central American policies and showed greater determination to achieve his goals. He insisted that military aid was essential to winning the war against communist expansion in the region. He took an especially hard line regarding the situation in El Salvador. A victory by the communist guerrillas would lead the country to join forces with Nicaragua and Cuba, and the domino effect would extend throughout the region, including Panama and Mexico, he averred. In April, before a joint session of Congress called by the president, which was unusual, Reagan reiterated that vital United States interests were at stake in Central America. And once again, he pointed to El Salvador's proximity as a threat to United States security. Only more military aid, he said, would allow this war to be won. The most influential newspaper criticized the speech harshly. Republican papers defended it. The guerrillas launched a major offensive in the morass, northeast, taking the Pan-American Highway and the town of Santa Rosa de Lima. On Radius Vencemeros, they announced that this was their answer to the war declared by Reagan. For the Reagan administration, the Central American policies had not fulfilled their objectives, and the fault lay with the officials who had designed them. The State Department proceeded to remove people from the team. Enders and Ambassador El Salvador Dean Hinton were relieved of their posts. Reagan named former Republican Congressman Richard Stone as a special envoy to Central America, and in June he named a bipartisan commission led by Henry Kissinger, to visit these countries, including Nicaragua, and to design a regional policy. At the same time, he kept up his military harassment. Stone's conversation with FDR leaders Guillermo Ungo and Ruben Zamora, and with FML comandantes in Costa Rica and Colombia, failed. Stone limited them to their participation in presidential elections after they demobilized. The Salvadoran government had to either change its strategy or lose the war, concluded John Wagelstein, the director of the Green Berets in El Salvador. John Wagelstein, in a meeting with President Magana, his Minister of Defense, and the United States ambassador. He showed documents that indicated the guerrillas controlled a quarter of the country and an ever-increasing number of towns. Besides, they had destroyed the economy. A report from the United States Embassy in San Salvador estimated losses since 1979 at $600 million. And another from the National University mentioned 210 acts of sabotage in 11 of the country's 14 provinces. Guerrillas' actions had destroyed a third of the electrical power system, 30% of the public transport, and a tenth of the agricultural sector. Only one main bridge remained standing. Another of the guerrillas' activities was the trial by revolutionary courts and execution of military officers, paramilitary goons, potentiates, and politicians. In May 1983, the Popular Liberation Forces, FPL, the most radical group in the FMLN, assassinated United States First Lieutenant Albert Schaufelberger in front of San Salvador's Catholic University when he was picking up his girlfriend. The guerrillas warned that they would send other advisors back in coffins. The FMLN continued its offensive. In October and November, some 7,000 guerrillas attacked more than 60 towns, and in December, they attacked the military base at El Paraiso, the country's largest, and caused 100 casualties. This was a devastating blow. 2 days later, they blew up the Cuscatlán Bridge. Defeats, casualties, and low morale wreaked havoc in the army ranks. Almost half the United States trained troops quit between September and December. More than 300 soldiers had been killed or seriously wounded in battle, and 450 were prisoners of war. In November, a 135-man battalion surrendered. The guerrillas explained that they would be handed over to the International Red Cross and took their weapons. Now, also alarming to Washington was the increase in the number of murders attributed to the death squads, since this showed they were out of the government's control. The State Department compiled lists, one in El Salvador and the other in Miami, of those suspected of belonging to these groups. It published the names of powerful Miami exiles who financed them. Until now, Reagan and Magana had held their tongues about the death squads, though there was clear evidence that they had connections with military officers on active service, and D'Aubusson was their leader. Newsweek noted that whenever D'Aubusson raised his voice against anyone, generally prominent persons, they turned up dead a few days later. Then, in November 1983, unable to talk about improvement in Salvadoran human rights picture, Reagan vetoed the bill that requested him to continue certifying human rights improvements to Congress. That same month, he invaded Grenada. Duarte for the presidency. In 1984, after 50 years of military dictatorship, El Salvador prepared to elect a civilian president. The country was stuck in a serious political and economic crisis and unprecedented violence by the military, paramilitaries, and guerrillas. The FMLN now controlled a third of the country, and the people's uneasiness was rising. The elections were crucial to El Salvador because its future, the development of the armed conflict, and the role to be played henceforward by the United States were all at stake. For Reagan, who had one eye on his re-election, they were crucial as well, since congressional support for his controversial military aid to the country and the future of the war depended on the outcome. Of the 7 candidates, the 2 most likely were Jose Napoleon Duarte of the center-left Christian Democrats and Roberto D'Aubusson of the extreme right-wing Arena Party. Washington worked feverishly to organize the elections and support Duarte. The presidential campaign was bitter and steeped in violence. On the eve of the elections, the army, some 30,000 men and 10,000 guerrillas, intensified their offensives. The FMLN declared that it would not interfere with the voting. Whoever wanted to vote could do so freely, but it called the election a farce and trumpeted the slogan, "No to the election farce, yes to the people's war." In various places, guerrillas blocked roads, confiscated identification cards, which were necessary to vote, ambushed the army, causing 30 casualties, and shot down a cargo plane, damaged a military highway, and occupied 3 broadcast stations in the capital. For 15 minutes, they transmitted a statement to alert the people to the electoral farce, which was not the solution to El Salvador's conflict, but a measure needed for Reagan's re-election. In May, the people went to the polls. In the AFP, AP, EFE, and Latin Reuter news agencies reported the chaos and disorganization, voting boxes that arrived late, others that never arrived to guerrillas-controlled zones, shortages of ballots, confusion in lists that indicated where voters were to go, and extreme security measures deployed at every voting place. The Central Electoral Council published the results a week late. Duarte had won 43 to 41% of the vote, and D'Aubuisson 29.76. Since no candidate won the required majority, a runoff vote gave Duarte 54%. He took office in June. Duarte's election was praised by the Reagan administration, Congress, and the press as a triumph of democracy. They called Duarte a genuine Democrat, a reformer who wanted peace. In his campaign, Duarte had offered a social pact and promised to end political assassinations, investigate the death squads, and abolish the abuses that had characterized past governments. A few months later, when these promises were a dead letter, he was called a victim of the extreme right and of guerrilla intransigence. Nobody mentioned that while he was president of the junta, El Salvador was the worst violator of human rights in the world, with a rate of 1,000 political murders a month by the army and by paramilitary groups. That's Duarte, the murderous butcher. Duarte went to Washington at Reagan's invitation and was cheered and praised by the government and the media, and heard with respect and enthusiasm by House and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Congress approved the supplementary appropriation of $61 million in military aid, and 3 months later, $132 million more, as well as $120 million in economic aid. On October 15, 1984, at the OAS General Assembly, Duarte invited the leadership of the insurgency to a meeting at Las Palmas in Chalatenango. Many were surprised at his proposal to negotiate with the guerrillas, since the military and the right were strongly opposed, in Washington even more so. Analysts concluded that Duarte, on a honeymoon with the Reagan administration and the United States Congress, felt strong enough to ignore this powerful and dangerous opposition. A week before the meeting in Las Palmas, Minister of Defense Vidas Castanova, who appointed Duarte, ratified because of military pressure, launched an offensive against the guerrillas, a resounding gesture of his rejection of the talks. Nevertheless, he accompanied Duarte to a meeting in the Las Palmas church. Guillermo Unga and Ruben Zamora, who were both invited, living in exile in Mexico, and the commanders Eduardo Sancho, also known as Ferben Cienfuegos, Facundo Guardado, and other guerrilla leaders, comprised a delegation of insurgents, and Archbishop Rivera y Damas served as medium. They were not able to arrive at a substantial agreement, but they did agree to name a peace commission, which would include 4 members from each side, to meet in November. The military immediately let Duarte know that he must not move too quickly or accept the ceasefire, or he would have problems. 4 days later, the guerrillas shot down helicopters, leaving 4 high-ranking officers dead, including Lieutenant Colonel Domingo Monterosa, who was commander in the El Mozota zone at the time of the 1981 massacre. Furious, the High Command warned Duarte that they would hold power over the actions of his government. A group of 60 officers advised him not to accept the insurgents' proposal to share the government and become part of the armed forces, and further, not to accept the ceasefire. Duarte did not object to these conditions. The FDR-FMLN proposal asked for a broadly inclusive transitional government, the integration of rebel troops into the armed forces, and new elections. Duarte would not agree, instead countering with a demand that the rebels lay down their arms, recognize his government legitimacy, and participate peacefully in the reconstruction of the country. In other words, they should surrender. Duarte remained under the church thumb of the military and Washington, both committed to escalating the war to annihilate the guerrillas. Peace talks threatened their plans. Washington kept sending weapons and helicopters and increased the number of military personnel in El Salvador. The army continued bombing guerrilla-controlled zones, causing innumerable deaths and colossal destruction. The guerrillas, in turn, continued to attack economic targets, military bases, and barracks, and ambushing the army, causing even more casualties. They attacked the El Parazo base and massacred an army patrol. They took over Cerron Grand hydroelectric plant, the country's largest, and destroyed part of its equipment. The State Department continued to reassure Congress that the human rights situation in El Salvador was improving, but the Salvadoran Human Rights Commission reported that there had been 400 political assassinations, 87 disappearances, 2 large massacres, and more than 100 bombings of campesino areas since Duarte had come to power. FDR leader Ungo said in a November interview with Mexican daily Uno Más Una that during the past 5 months, Duarte had ordered 127 bombings, using more than 1,000 bombs in 10 of the country's 14 provinces, and new massacres in Chalatenango, Cabañas, and Cuscatlan. During the same period, the FMLN was responsible for 547 military casualties. In November, Reagan was reelected. In March 1985, the guerrillas executed retired General Jose Alberto Medrano, one of the worst killers, according to Duarte, creator of Orden, a government paramilitary organization that functioned as a death squad, dissolved in 1979. 4 days later, they shot down Lieutenant Colonel Ricardo Aristides Cienfuegos inside an executive tennis club in San Salvador. In June, a group of guerrillas machine gunned 4 United States Marines, embassy security guards, and 2 government businessmen in a cafe in the fashionable Zona Rosa in downtown San Salvador. 7 Salvadorans were also among those killed and 15 were wounded. In a statement, the Partido Revolutionary Workers' Party of Central America, PRTC, claimed responsibility and announced that these were the only first, alleging that the Marines were not innocent since no Yankee invader was free of guilt. The statement profoundly regretted the death of the Salvadorans. In the past 6 months, the guerrillas had kidnapped a large number of mayors, bureaucrats, and military officers. In September 1985, the kidnapping of Inés Duarte Duran, the president's 35-year-old daughter, by an FMLN commando, changed the rules of the game. Duarte bowed to the guerrilla demands, freeing 22 political prisoners and allowing 96 wounded guerrillas to be transferred to Cuba. Arena, the right, and the military all protested that the president's show of weakness affected the army's morale and undermined the government's credibility. Duarte retorted that they were merely singing a siren's song since they sent their money out of the country and paid ransoms to free kidnapped family members, and that the guerrillas used this money to buy weapons, kill soldiers, and make the revolution. The guerrillas freed Inez and 28 of the 38 mayors they were holding. Duarte sent his family to Washington. The concessions Duarte made to the guerrillas complicated his relations with the military, not that they had been easy to begin with, but both knew that Washington would not tolerate a coup. Politically, the government was eroding. The people criticized Duarte for the grave economic crisis and accused him of being Washington's puppet. They also announced his support for the war against Nicaragua, his collaboration on the boycott of Contadora, and his suspension of the peace talks because of United States and Army pressures. In 1986, national and international human rights organizations rallied against the increase in military and paramilitary violence in El Salvador. Amnesty International pointed out that murders, tortures, and disappearances were now selective, carried out against those who opposed the government. These crimes were not investigated and their perpetrators were not brought to justice. On the anniversary of the assassination of Monsignor Arnulfo Romero, a large demonstration in El Salvador demanded trial and convictions of his assassins. 6 years after the crime, these people were still at large. After the peace talks, at Araguailo were suspended in November 1984. Duarte rejected different peace proposals offered by the FDR, FMLN, but in June 1985, he announced that he was ready to renew the talks. Two preparatory meetings were held in Mexico and Panama. The third was held in Sosuri, was canceled by the guerrillas because the army militarized the town before the meeting. Duarte accused the guerrillas of torpedoing the peace talks. In 1986, the army again boycotted attempts to negotiate with the guerrillas. So we're going to make some comments here. I think it's important to just review some of this stuff. There's a lot of information in this chapter. One of the important things to understand is, Reagan was a murderer. He was a mass murderer and a murderous anti-Hispanic butcher. He committed, crime after crime in El Salvador. He called it a democracy. He called it a human rights improvement and all of that stuff. Just all lies. Just peddle the lies and fraud and deceit in the American media and the American official viewpoints. The junta, basically the junta was in power and there was a re-election occurring. But what happened? The United States media, again, came through with vicious propaganda fraud. They said the election was great. They took pictures of, long lines of campesinos waiting patiently to vote. They characterized the election as free, democratic, and legitimate, which refuted reality. They were delusional. This was a farce election. This was a fraud election by Reagan and the U.S. government, gun violent, murderous butchers. This ended up being a fraud election. There are many books on this: Necessary Illusions, Turning the Tide, Intervention in Central America. Chomsky details, specific articles that the New York Times, Washington Post fabricated information. They deliberately fabricated and lied on oath. I mean, it's oath, or journalism is oath. If you lie, you are a fraud. And they were deceitful liars at the New York Times, Washington Post, and all of these American U.S. mass media outlets that supported Reagan in this farce, this nonsense that the Salvadoran election was true. It was a fraud. It was a military takeover. It was just a right-wing, give the votes to the people. They didn't even count the votes. It was all just fraud. Racist white American butcher fraud. So that was that. That was the democracy, the election, then losing the war. Okay, so basically Reagan was losing this war again. The guerrillas were causing, major problems for the U.S. government. They were, murdering, Marines. They were murdering people. They wanted the Yankees out. I mean, most Latin American places, the same thing. Go home, Yankee. Racist, go home is what they say. But the American murderous butchers overstay their welcome all the time. They overstay their welcome because they are racist, murderous white butchers. So that was, basically he was losing the war. The question was whether he was losing the war. And finally, we went to Duarte. He was losing the war. The guerrillas made major advances. They continued their offensives. They blew up bridges. They, killed, many troops, the Green Berets, the American white Green Berets service, the military murderous butchers of the Green Berets, always brought out to, slaughter the people of Central America. It is a group of whites that is, focused on Central American murder. I mean, that's basically what it is. It is a group of whites that is used for Central American and Latin American murder. And that is what the Green Berets are, so that you understand a little of the, history of this. And then the FMLN's offensive continued, the increasing number of murders. So there were just, thousands and thousands of murders, 30,000 in the last 2 years. But, over and over, the U.S. government said human rights is improving, right? Human rights, the State Department Human Rights Report in El Salvador says that everything is improving. Again, propagandist lies and deceit by U.S. government organizations that is just a group of white frauds, just, lying frauds. Duarte was elected into power, and Duarte, was a mass murderer. He was president of the junta, while Carter was in power. He was good friends with Jimmy Carter. He was a mass murderer, and nobody ever, nobody ever discussed any problem with Duarte. Duarte was a mass murderer. He was worse than Romero. And, Reagan just followed him into the presidency of El Salvador and followed him with, nice aid, large amounts of millions of dollars of U.S. machine guns and violent, equipment to cause mass slaughter of the Hispanics in El Salvador. So continuing on, let's continue. The FDR-FMLN proposal asked for a broadly inclusive transitional government, the integration of rebel troops into the armed forces, and new elections. Duarte would not agree, instead countering with a demand that the rebels lay down their arms, recognize his government legitimacy, and participate peacefully in the reconstruction of the country. In other words, they should surrender. Duarte remained under the thumb of the military in Washington, both committed to escalating war to annihilate the guerrillas. Peace talks threatened their plans. Washington kept sending weapons and helicopters and increasing the number of its military personnel in El Salvador. The army continued bombing guerrilla control zones, including innumerable deaths and colossal destruction. The guerrillas in turn continued to attack economic targets and military bases and barracks, and ambushing the army, causing even more casualties. They attacked the El Paraiso base and massacred an army patrol. They took over the Saran Grande hydroelectric plant, the country's largest, and destroyed part of its equipment. The State Department continued to reassure Congress that the human rights situation in El Salvador was improving, but the Salvadoran Human Rights Commission reported that there had been 400 political assassinations, 87 disappearances, 2 large massacres, and more than 100 bombings of campesinos since Duarte had come to power. FDR leader Ungo said in a November interview with a Mexican daily Uno Mas Uno that during the past 5 months, Duarte ordered 127 bombings using more than 100 bombs in 10 of the country's 14 provinces, and new massacres in Chalatenango, Cabanas, and Cuscatlan. During the same period, the FMLN was responsible for 574 military casualties. In November, Reagan was reelected. In March 1985, guerrillas executed retired General Jose Alberto Medrano, one of the worst killers according to Duarte, creator of Orden, a government paramilitary organization that funded as a death squad, dissolved in 1979. 4 days later, they shot down Lieutenant Colonel Ricardo Aristides Cienfuegos inside an exclusive tennis club in San Salvador. In June, a group of guerrillas machine gunned 4 United States Marine Embassy security guards and 2 American businessmen in a cafe in the fashionable Zona Rosa in downtown San Salvador. 7 San Salvadorans were among those killed, and 15 were wounded. In a statement, the Partido Revolucionario, the Revolutionary Workers' Party of Central America, claimed responsibility and announced that these were only the first, alleging that the Marines were not innocent since no Yankee invader was free of guilt. The statement profoundly regretted the death of Salvadorans. In the past 6 months, the guerrillas had kidnapped a large number of mayors, bureaucrats, and military officers. We're going to skip a little bit because I already read this, information. The opposition to Duarte's government continued to grow, and in January 1987, rumors of a coup circulated. Military openly criticized Duarte. The right was dead set against him. 27 opposition delegates called a paramilitary strike because of a tax increase, and a 150,000-strong student demonstration protested forced recruitment. The guerrillas continued to ambush the military block transportation routes, and blow up electric transmission towers, which left large areas of the country without light. On January 24th, a business strike, a transportation stoppage called by the FMLN, and a road blockage by the guerrillas paralyzed the country. Many called for Duarte's resign. Nonetheless, the military announced that it supported the president's authority. We're going to go back, because there was one section that, I didn't speak about. The concession Duarte made to the guerrillas complicated his relations with the military, not that they had been easy to begin with, but both knew that Washington would not tolerate a coup. Politically, the government was eroding. The people criticized Duarte for the grave economic crisis and accused him of being Washington's puppet. They also denounced his support for the war against Nicaragua, his collaboration with the boycott of the Contadora, and his suspension of the peace talks because of United States and Army pressures. In 1986, the national and international human rights organizations rallied against the increase in military and paramilitary violence in El Salvador. Amnesty International pointed out that murders, tortures, and disappearances were now selective, carried out against those who opposed the government. These crimes were not investigated, and their perpetrators were not brought to justice. On the anniversary of the assassinations, Monsignor Arnulfo Romero, a large demonstration in San Salvador, demanded the trials and convictions of his assassins. 6 years after these crimes, these people were still at large. After the peace talks of Arguelca, After the peace talks of Arguello were suspended in 1984, Duarte rejected 5 different proposals offered by the FDR-FMLN, but in June 1985 he announced that he was ready to renew the talks. 2 preparatory meetings were held in Mexico and Panama. The third, to be held in Sosuri, was canceled by the guerrillas because the army militarized the town before the meeting. Duarte accused the guerrillas of torpedoing the peace talks. In 1986, the army again boycotted attempts to negotiate with the guerrillas. So we're going to go back to where we were, just ended. The signing of the Esquipulas II Regional Peace Treaty by the 5 Central American presidents in August 1987 opened the gates to a solution for Nicaragua's and El Salvador's internal conflicts. The governments were obliged by the terms of the treaty to take the immediate steps toward national coexistence. Duarte presented to the Legislative Assembly a plan for a partial amnesty for people who had been indicted for political and related crimes, but who had not yet been tried, as well as for the repatriation of exiles. In October, thousands of refugees returned under the protection of the Catholic and Protestant churches and international organizations. Duarte called a third round of negotiations suspended for 3 years, but the FDR-FMLN announced that it would not participate in protest against the murder of previous October of Herbert Ernesto Anaya, director of the Human Rights Commission of El Salvador. In November, FDR leaders Guillermo Ungo and Ruben Zamora returned after 7 years in exile. They announced that they would continue the support of the people's struggle. Duarte dismissed them as terrorists and announced that if they wanted to participate in politics, they would have to break their ties to the guerrillas. The same month, Duarte presented a total and absolute amnesty law to the Legislative Assembly, which was approved by wide majority. The law exempted from trial any members of the military, the security services, and the police who were responsible for the assassination and disappearance of tens of thousands of Salvadorans, and suspended all trials and investigation of crimes committed before October 22nd of that year. More than 400 prisoners convicted of political crimes were released, among them the murderers of the agrarian reform experts at the Sheraton Hotel. Crimes of kidnapping, extortion, and drug trafficking were excluded. In response to a petition from the church, Archbishop Romero's killers were not granted amnesty. A report issued by America's Watch noted that after the amnesty law was passed, there was a marked increase in political crimes. Duarte could not end the war because the military and Washington would not let him. Neither was he able to improve the difficult economic situation and effect after the war. The country stayed afloat only with economic aid from the United States. Duarte's emergency measures were, Duarte's emergency measures were rejected by both the left and the right. His promised social pact was not feasible. The country was mired in misery and war. He promised the country was mired in misery and war. The real weight of this serious economic crisis fell on the poorer classes. 6 out of every 7 Salvadorans was unemployed, and the prices of consumer products were well out of the reach of most people. After 7 years of war, society was profoundly polarized. The people were traumatized by the military and paramilitary violence. The country was devastated in the ruins. The dirty war had cost tens of thousands of civilian lives, which thousands more maimed and tens of thousands widowed and orphaned. A fourth of the population, a vast majority of them campesino, was displaced in exile to other countries or with the guerrillas. During his last year in office, Duarte, by now completely discredited, fell seriously ill with liver cancer. In the municipal and legislative assembly elections in March 1988, his Christian Democratic Party suffered a crushing defeat. Arena, the winning party, was as surprised as anyone. It was handed an absolute majority in the legislative assembly and won 202 of 244 municipalities. Its triumph in presidential elections set for the following year was practically assured. Throughout the year, the bloody fight between the army and the guerrillas continued. Christ turned his back. peace would not come, and cancer was consuming the president. So stubborn, proud, and alone as he always lived, Napoleon awaits his death, fighting cancer from the helm with the ship of the state, wrote a correspondent for the Spanish daily El País. After almost a year of Duarte's battle with cancer, Salvador spoke of his survival as a miracle. In January 1989, with the country at war, the presidential campaign moved ahead. The FDR FMLN presented another peace proposal through Archbishop Rivera y Damas that promised that it would respect the election results if the army did not interfere or continue its repressive actions, and would participate in the elections if the government would postpone them until September and ensure that the vote would be impartial and clean. It asked for a new electoral council and the participation of the Democratic Convergence, the Democratic Union created by Ungo and Zamora, a new oversight committee composed of religious, humanitarian, and civil organizations, and the presence of international observers to observe the elections. The United States would have to remain outside the process. Duarte rejected the proposal, calling it unconstitutional. The military and arena rejected it as well. On January 20th, 1989, Republican George Bush was inaugurated president of the United States. The new administration understood the absurdity of continuing to support the war and recognized the political way out in the FDR-FMLN proposal. The State Department called it serious and noted that it contained positive elements that deserve further studies. This change in Washington's position means that Duarte and the Salvadoran political parties, including ARENA, would have to change course. The opposition proposed a partial amnesty to allow the guerrillas to come to San Salvador and meet with the political parties. In February, they met at Axtep, Mexico, but the talks came to no agreement. Duarte offered to postpone the elections to April if the guerrillas would declare a unilateral truce until June 10th, the day he was to hand over the reins of government to the successor. The FMLN offered a 60-day truce and proposed a new meeting with the parties of San Salvador. But the political atmosphere was too contaminated to achieve change. The Minister of Defense, Vidas Casanova, who was opposed to negotiations, warned that a coup d'etat was possible if the Constitution were violated. The army continued its military operations against the guerrillas and, in turn, intensified their own. The Central Elections Council ratified the date for the election, which would be held on March 19, 1989. This was a dagger in the heart for anyone who would hope for an accord. The rebel radio station Radio Venceramos alerted listeners, "We stand at a historical crossroads, negotiation or the intensification of the war." The violence continued. There were more political murders, and 3 journalists were killed, one of whom was Dutch. More dynamite was detonated by the guerrillas, and street disturbances were constant. Duarte militarized the country. FMLN announced a boycott of the elections, blocked transportation, blew up electric transmission towers, attacked barracks, and threatened with death any officials who took part in this farce. Throughout the country, 136 mayors resigned. Alfredo Cristiani, an arena candidate, captured 54% of the votes. Fidel Chavez Mena, the Christian Democrat, 36%, and Guillermo Ungo of the Democratic Convergence, a pathetic 3%. The abstentions of 50% of the voters was the highest in El Salvador's history. Chavez Mena and Ungo attributed their defeat to FMLN's boycott. Spokespeople for the guerrillas claimed that the large-scale abstention was evidence of illegitimacy of a government that did not represent the national majority. The cost of peace. With Alfredo Cristiani, 1989 to 1993 as president, power remained in the hands of the most reactionary forces in the country, the oligarchy and the army, represented by ARENA, the party born of the death squads. The defeat of the Christian Democrats and the Democratic Convergence demonstrated that the options for change toward a just society and to achieving peace were no longer possible. The only choice was to keep waging the war. In his inaugural speech, Cristiani proposed renewing the dialogue with the guerrillas. The FMLN opened an intense military offensive in order to come to the table from a position of strength. The army declared itself in a state of maximum alert and showed the increased determination to annihilate the guerrillas. The difficult negotiations unfolded over a period of 3 years in the midst of extreme violence without arriving at any substantial agreements. On November 11th, the FMLN launched a bold offensive in San Salvador, and the army bombed working-class neighborhoods where 1,500 guerrillas had barricaded themselves. The FMLN took the Sheraton Hotel, where 4 Green Berets and OAS Secretary General João Bain Soares was lodged. Bush sent a commando from the Delta Force. The evacuation of the Green Berets without incident prevented them from moving into action. Hours later, Baena Soares had left with the guerrillas' help. The combat lasted for 5 days, leaving 1,000 civilians and fighters dead in its wake, mostly as a result of the bombing. 5 days later, on the campus of Catholic University, UCA, 6 Jesuits, including the rector, Father Ignacio Ilacuria, their housekeeper, and her daughter were assassinated. This incident moved the world. The government tried to blame the FMLN, but it was almost immediately clear that the murders was the work of the army. Washington demanded that the crime be cleared up, and Congress made further aid contingent on the investigation and punishment of the perpetrators. A commission of 20 United States representatives proceeded to investigate it. The peace accords between Cristiani's government and the FMLN that put an end to 12 years of war were signed at a dramatic United Nations session in New York early in the morning of January 1st, 1992, just hours before the end of Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar's term in office. Immense joy broke out throughout El Salvador and the world. Nevertheless, there were still key issues to be resolved, and these would depend on the political will of both sides. The government had to reduce the armed forces from 56,000 to 20,000, purge their ranks, bring to justice the members of the police forces responsible for human rights violations, serious human rights abuses. The officer was clearly opposed to this. The officer class was firmly opposed to this, and the FMLN had to agree to demobilize its forces. The definitive ceasefire was set for February 10, 1992. The United States Truth Commission, part of these accords, published its report in March 1993. Its job had been to investigate the most serious political crimes committed during the 12 years of war. The report received support from all over the world. President Bill Clinton praised it, and New York Times commented that the White House stopped short of drawing the conclusion that the Reagan and Bush administration, which strongly supported the Salvadoran military in its war with leftist guerrillas, bore some responsibility for the gross human rights abuses. The commission certified that 85% of the crimes were committed by the Army, the security forces, and the death squads. It accused high-ranking officers based on sufficient evidence of being the architects of the Jesuits' murder. It mentioned former ministers of defense Rene Emilio Ponce and Vidas Casanova and Air Force Commander Juan Rafael Bustillo. It also accused other officers of having issued the order to kill the 4 North American nuns, the 4 Dutch journalists, and Monsignor Romero. It indicated that Dub Aubusson was behind his murder. At a press conference held the day after the report was made public, Cristiani urged the Legislative Assembly to pass a law of total and general amnesty, which he assured everyone was essential to consummate the national reconciliation and leave the past behind. The Assembly, continued by Arena, did just that. The inappropriate haste to shield the guilty, wrote the New York Times, is an affront to the peace process promoted by the UN, to international human rights laws, and to the memory of the victims of El Salvador. The amnesty went into effect at the end of March, and confessed and convicted military criminals began coming out of the jails. Guerrillas responsible for killing United States citizens did not benefit from this amnesty. This was a discriminatory measure without legal basis. The Truth Commission's accusations were no more than simple testimonies for the history books, since the commissions had no power to bring the perpetrators of the crime to justice. The invasion of Grenada. Another of Reagan's wars was the invasion of Grenada on October 25th, 1983. The invasion was announced in advance. Maurice Bishop, the prime minister, saw it coming many times, and many times he denounced before the world the peril hanging over the tiny island. The American press dismissed Bishop's fears as paranoia. When the invasion came, he was already dead. In March 1979, the leader of the New Jewel movements overthrew the repressive and corrupt regime of Eric Gairy. Thousands of Grenadians poured into the streets to welcome the new government. The working classes and the mass organization supported it. Within a month, Bishop established diplomatic relations with Cuba, and Washington subsequently became alarmed. Grenada was another revolution that began to have an impact on its neighbors. In the Caribbean island of Dominica, a broad-based popular movement overthrew the dictatorial regime of Patrick John. In St. Lucia, the leftist Labor Party won at the polls and defeated the rightist regime of more than 15 years, and a popular coalition, MAN-MER, won a victory in the Netherlands Antilles. These changes upset Washington since they complicated the United States' presence in the Caribbean, where Cuba exerted its influence. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, Michael Manley, Forbes Burnham of Guyana, and Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, all progressive, non-aligned leaders, maintained close relations with Havana. Castro celebrated Bishop's victory and immediately began to send him aid. Neither Bishop's government nor leftist leanings, nor his courtship of Cuba and the Soviet Union pleased Washington and Great Britain. Grenada was a member of the British Commonwealth and had a governor representing the Queen. The Carter administration warned that such policies would bring the withdrawal of United States aid and sought to isolate Bishop. It pressured members of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, to disavow the new Jewel government and offered an economic development plan for the region with loans from the IMF and the World Bank, for which only friendly nations qualified. Carter's intervention was indirect and failed. Bishop established the People's Revolutionary Government. With the working people, he said, "We will build and advance towards socialism and arrive at the final victory." The country was in ruins with corruption running rampant and unemployment rate reaching 50% and no social services. Bishop dismantled the army, created a new one, as well as a militia, sought popular participation through mass organizations, broadened health and education services. He made secondary education free, promoted the unionization of the working class. It rose to 80%. And introduced social legislation to bring gender equality to the workplace. Economic growth in 1982 was 5.5%, compared with the 1.1% of neighboring islands, and the private sector increased by 10%. The people loved Bishop, supported his policies, and applauded his honest position in the face of the imperialists and Reagan's accusation against the country. Other political and economic sectors did not agree with his government's socialist orientation and put up resistance, but they were an unthreatening minority. Reagan was not eager to allow Bishop's revolution to progress. During his presidential campaign, he was already calling him a communist, the most serious condemnation coming from his lips, and Grenada a threat to United States security. His alarm was an extremely ridiculous position from a representative of the world's superpower. Grenada was a tiny Caribbean island of 110,000 inhabitants, 215 square miles in size, with an economy based on an export of nutmeg, and had no army or navy. The threat was also taken up by the report of the Santa Fe Committee, written by a group of Republicans for Reagan's campaign. They claimed that Grenada was part of a communist conspiracy led by the Soviet Union, like Cuba and Nicaragua, constituting a direct threat to the United States security. Reagan's heaviest attack was waged on the international airport being built with Cuban resistance. He declared that it would be a Soviet and Cuban military base. Bishop assured him that it was being built to stimulate tourism, not terrorism, and that it would not be used by the Soviet Union or Cuba. Bishop tried to maintain normal relations with the United States, but was met with hostile treatment. The State Department did not accept the credentials of the Grenadian ambassador nominated by Bishop and accredited its own ambassador to Grenada, but stationed him in Barbados. Reagan ignored two letters from Bishop in which Bishop set forth his government's good intentions towards the United States. In the second letter, dated August 1981, he mentioned the hostile policies of Reagan's government toward his country and the gestures of United States envoys to the European Economic Community in trying to dissuade these countries from aiding Grenada with the reconstruction of the airport. He also referred to the training of Grenadian mercenaries in Miami who were being prepared to invade his country, the United States blocking of Grenada's loans, requests to the World Bank and the IMF, and the conditions set forth that both exclude Grenada, the country which the United States attached to grants to the Caribbean Development Bank. In 1981, the extensive United States military maneuvers in the Caribbean, Ocean Venture 81, and the simulated invasion and rescue of supposedly kidnapped Americans on the island of Vázquez in Puerto Rico carried the codename Amber Amberines in a clear allusion to Grenada and the Grenadines. Bishop understood the message and launched a campaign in the United Nations, the OAS, the non-aligned movement, and with friendly governments and political parties throughout the world to denounce the United States' threat of an invasion of his country. In March 1983, the Pentagon published aerial photographs that showed military installations in Grenada and claimed that they were Soviet type and that they continued anti-aircraft emplacements. The same month, during a televised speech, Reagan showed secret photographs to claim once again that the airport was a danger to United States security because of Grenada's obvious militarization by the Soviet Union and Cuba. During an official visit to Barbados, Reagan alerted Prime Minister Torn Adam and Jamaican Prime Minister Edward Seaga to the propagation of communist virus in the region from Grenada. The two heads of state shared his concerns. Bishop called Reagan's accusations that he was militarizing the country, building a naval base, an air base, munitions depots, barracks, and a military training camp on the island, a pack of lies. In a radio broadcast, he warned his brothers and sisters about an imminent invasion by counter-revolutionary gangs, organized finance, trained and directed by North American imperialists. In April 1983, the Grenadan delegation to the United Nations rejected Reagan's accusations and ridiculed the photographic display it created to demonize the airport. It asserted that the United States was the first country Grenada had asked for assistance in building the airport, but that Grenada was rebuffed. Reagan became the laughing stock of the world, according to the Daily Granma, referring to his campaign against Grenada. In June, Bishop went to Washington uninvited and spoke with members of Congress, journalists, intellectuals, and Grenadans residing in the United States. He was seeking their support and help in convincing Washington to suspend its hostility. Excuse me. In a speech at New York's Hunter College, he spoke about his country's situation, the social and economic advances his government had made. He mentioned the difficulties he was having with the Reagan administration's hostility, in spite of the efforts he was making to improve, relations. He mentioned a secret Defense Department report that maintained that the revolution in Grenada was the worst for the United States and the Cuban or Nicaraguan revolutions because the people there spoke English and communicated that the United States. He mentioned of the difficulties he was having with and the Reagan administration's hostility. In spite of the efforts he was having to improve relations, he mentioned a secret Defense Department report that maintained that the revolution in Grenada was worse for the United States and then the Cuban or Nicaraguan revolutions because the people there spoke English and could communicate directly with the United States. Grenada's population was 95% black, and its leaders could set a dangerous example for the 30 million American blacks. This aspect, Bishop argued, was doubtless one of the most sensitive in the document. General Hudson Austin led a coup d'etat on October 1983, and Bishop, 3 members of his cabinet, and 2 labor leaders were assassinated. 17 people died in the riots the coup unleashed. Bishop's assassination and the takeover of the island by a Marxist group, supposedly more radical, was the pretext Reagan needed to justify invading Grenada. He availed himself of the tired old excuse that he was saving the lives of American citizens and reestablishing internal order. As many as 600 young United States citizens were studying tropical medicine at a United States school. The Pentagon diverted a fleet to Grenada carrying 1,900 Marines and intended for Lebanon, where a car bomb had just exploded at a United States barracks, killing 237 Marines. A United States military transport and a helicopter, both loaded with soldiers, landed in Barbados following a DC-9 with more soldiers. The orders were ready for a possible evacuation of American residents of Grenada. The official story about the invasion of Grenada, codenamed Urgent Fury, was that it was multinational, as a major United States newspaper headlined it. The Pentagon reported that at dawn on October 25th, 2,000 Marines and assault troops landed at St. George, the capital of Grenada, a town of 4,800 inhabitants, and that later 200 soldiers from 6 Caribbean countries joined them. The invasion began the beginning of the landing of 400 soldiers by helicopters from the warship USS Guam, anchored to the east of the island. They attacked the Pearls Airport, and hundreds of Rangers and elite American force parachuted onto Point Salinas, where the controversial international airport was being built. According to a statement from the Pentagon, the Rangers were met with anti-aircraft fire from the barracks where the Cuban engineers were lodged. The first reports mentioned that 2 United States soldiers died, 23 were wounded, and most objectives were taken within 12 hours. The Pentagon prevented any journalists from getting onto the island for a period of 5 days. This was the first time such a prohibition had been issued, and later shepherded by small groups of them to restrict restricted location. Time reported that the invading troops from 600 well-armed and trained Cubans, Secretary of State George Shultz, stated at a press conference that the Cubans were resisting and firing, and of course, this obliges the United States to respond. Some 1,200 soldiers and between 2,000 and 5,000 Grenadian militia members faced the Rangers. On the third day, according to the Pentagon, its troops numbered 5,000 paratroopers, 500 Marines, 500 Rangers. Later reports mentioned a combined force of 12,000. On October 25th, they began evacuation of the 500 to 1,000 United States students and teachers. Shortly after the start of the invasion, Reagan spoke to the nation to declare that he had received an urgent formal request from the 5 member nations of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States to assist a joint effort to restore order and democracy on the island, and that he acceded to the request to join multinational forces. The overriding importance of the request to join, the overriding importance of the effort, he claimed, was to protect human life, forestall further chaos, and establish law and order where a brutal group of leftist thugs violently seized power, killing the prime minister and members of his cabinet. He asked this collective action not be misinterpreted, since it had been forced on us by events that have no precedent in the Eastern Caribbean. The Cuban government accused the United States by noting that the invasion begun this morning was prepared and rehearsed for over 2 years in the Puerto Rican island of Vieques, and that the invasion was not improvised, taking advantage of the situation created by Bishop's death. What is going on here is a premeditated aggression by Washington, accused Grandma. The resistance of Cuban platoons and armed workers came to an end on October 26, the news agencies reported. They immolated themselves for the motherland, commented Castro, who gave the order not to surrender. That day, new United States military reinforcements arrived. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger reported the deaths of 6 soldiers, 8 lost, and 33 wounded. He claimed that they had encountered much more resistance than expected. The victory over Grenada caused enormous cheer in the United States, and Reagan's popularity surged. An opinion poll indicated a 71% approval rate for the invasion. Reagan spoke of it in a superlative, calling it a major foreign policy success, and the Marines heroes of freedom for defeating some 750 Cubans and their Grenadian allies. It was a great victory, not only politically but strategically, he added. A high official crowed that none of the world would know that the United States was no paper tiger. The Pentagon spoke of a military victory with few casualties. 19 died in accidents. 24 Cubans and 44 Grenadans died in combat or from the bombing, according to the United States media. 5 years later, when the truth emerged, New York Times correspondent Joseph Thriaster wrote that the invasion was not a glorious demonstration for the military. The operation was plagued by errors. It destroyed a hospital for mental patients, for example, and full of improvisations. The commandos from the various forces could not communicate because their radars were not comparable and they only had tourist maps. The broad support for Reagan's warring action in Grenada was surprising, wrote the United States journalist Stephen Vogt, but was explained by the public's need for a quote-unquote victory to get out from under the humiliation of Vietnam, Iran, and the most recent tragedy of the death of 237 Marines in Lebanon 2 days before the invasion. While the Reagan administration was preparing the Grenadian dish for public consumption, the nation's electronic and print media were setting this table, wrote Vogue. The media transmitted only the official message. It was not a matter of United States invading Grenada, but of a United States confrontation with Cuba and the Soviet Union. That was the way the Washington Post and New York Times reported it. International disgust. The invasion of Grenada left the world community indignant, stupefied, and disgusted. Governments, institutions, organizations, churches, prominent personalities, and parliaments of many countries condemned the United States government. Even Reagan's loyal ally, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, complained that the United States had the nerve to invade an island of the British Commonwealth and violate its sovereignty without informing Her Majesty. Reagan was surprised and hurt by Maggie's criticism. He did not expect it after the generous and wide-ranging help he had given the Great Britain, assuring its victory in the Falkland Malvinas Island War. Reagan associated the invasion of Grenada with a terrorist attack in Lebanon. He stated that Moscow had not only aided and abetted the violence in both countries, but that it had provided assistance through a network of terrorists and agents. Conversely, many compared the invasion of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Many compared Reagan's invasion with the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. The point of view hurt Reagan. His invitation from the tiny Caribbean countries was just as equivocal as Brezhnev's from the Afghan government. To demonstrate the legitimacy of the multinational intervention of Grenada, Dominica's Prime Minister Maria Eugenia Charles requested an extraordinary session of the OAS's Permanent Council, but only as a form of protocol and without debates. She wanted to avoid the avalanche of criticism that opposed the invasion. The majority was able to express its revulsion and point to the flagrant United States violation of the principles of free self-determination and non-intervention and of the OAS Charter. There was no resolution. In the United Nations Security Council, during a meeting requested by Nicaragua, the terms of the resolution condemning the invasion were toned down so that the United States would not veto it, but it vetoed it anyway. This was the only vote against it. 11 nations voted in favor of it, and Great Britain, Togo, and Zaire abstained. Shortly thereafter, the General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning the invasion by a vote of 108 in favor, 9 against, the United States and the Caribbean countries that participated, and 27 abstentions. Most of the 63 speakers condemned the United States for violating international law and clear principles on which are based the relations of a civilized world. Reagan commented that this news did not spoil his breakfast. Reagan was not troubled by the fact that the United States was isolated in the United Nations, that his administration had lost credibility in the world community, and that there was general condemnation, or that not one of his NATO allies had voted in his favor. Neither did he care about the barrage of internal criticism from the press. With this unprecedented action, he had kept the public in the dark and enabled the Pentagon to manipulate it. This episode was a display of arrogance such as the world had never seen before. 5 years later, 5 years after the invasion, or the rescue operation, as the Grenadians called it, Grenada began to bloom. It had a new democracy with all its frailties. Under Prime Minister Herbert Blaise, elected in 1984 in an election plotted and arranged by the United States, new businesses grew, agro-industry prospered, and big international airport at Point Salinas, constructed in a large part by Cubans and completed by the United States, British, and Canadian help, was operation, and the hotels, which had remained vacant for 4 years, were beginning to welcome a few tourists, mostly British. But not everything was coming up roses. Economic difficulties were on the rise, and United States aid, never enough, though it tried to repair the damage it caused with the bombing, diminished. Unemployment hovered between 20 and 30%. Health and education services deteriorated with the departure of the Cuban teachers and doctors, and the United States troops initiated the flowering of prostitution and venereal disease. The international airport attracted drug traffic. Growing drug use forced Blaise to mount a campaign against it. We are seeing crimes here we've never seen before, commented one Grenadan. 5 years after his assassination, the much-loved Maurice Bishop remained in the memories of most people who pined for the social laws of his revolution, dismantled in the short period of semi-colonialism imposed by the invaders. At the beginning of December 1988, 14 people implicated the bishop's murder went to the gallows, among them Hudson Austin, commander of the extinct Revolutionary Armed Forces, who had taken over the government, and the vice prime minister, Bernard Coard, the brains of the coup, and his wife, a major leader of the New Jewel movement. The party's over. In January 1989, the Reagan era ended. In his farewell address, he assured the country he was leaving it more prosperous, more secure, and happier. The reality was somewhat different. He left it in the highest budgetary and commercial debts in history. In fact, he left the biggest debtor in the world. His economic policy strengthened the rich and impoverished the poor, the majority, whose social welfare programs he had slashed. Small enterprises and businesses were going under. During his administration, the number of homeless had grown to massive proportions, with many people wandering the streets of New York and Washington, sleeping in cardboard boxes on the streets of underground subway tunnels. The most militaristic of the United States presidents had led the country into the miserable failures in Nicaragua and El Salvador, two small, poor countries. When he left the White House, in spite of the massive amounts of hugely expensive military aid he had given El Salvador to defeat the guerrillas, the latter continued to wage the war until the government was forced to seek a negotiated peace. Reagan's secret war was this with the Contra mercenary gangs was revealed to be a costly fiasco. The Sandinistas he had wanted to overthrow continued to govern. The two sides arrived at peace accords only after he left the presidency. The Iran-Contra investigations continued. The episode, according to the final report of the Congressional Commission that investigated it, had been one of fraud, contempt of law, and President's persistent lack of honor. But no one challenged him in Congress. No one contradicted his distortions and his outright lies, and almost tolerated the "I do not recall," which he lodged his responsibility for this huge scandal, the most serious abuse of power by any United States head of state. He lied to Congress, the public, and his allies. He contradicted his own foreign policy. He secretly broke the arms embargo on Iran, which he had forced his allies to join, did business with terrorists, and violated the United States Neutrality Act. But he walked away unscathed, and nobody went to jail. North considered a run for president, and Bush, one of his last acts before being defeated by Clinton, pardoned the main figures of the Iran-Contra scandal, among them Weinberger, Abrams, Alan Fears, and Robert McFarlane. The New York Times headlined an editorial, "Bush's Unpardonable Act." The editorial noted that with this pardon, Bush was pardoning himself, as well as closing this shameful episode of American history. It was the bloodiest and most painful period of the superpowers' relationship with the small Central American country. So excellent chapter. We're going to make some comments here. Basically, we wanted to discuss. So basically, Washington, the U.S. government, Ronald Reagan, he was an abysmal failure. He's an abysmal failed president. He's a racist, white, murderous butchers. He's a colonial imperialist that, couldn't stand Grenada. And we'll get to that in a second. But he, miserably failed in El Salvador and Nicaragua, the two places. The Nicaraguan Hispanics would not accept Reagan as doing anything successful. They hated his guts, and he was, a murderous butcher of Hispanics in El Salvador, in Nicaragua. And in El Salvador, the same thing, a small country. He created a mass murder campaign. They hated him. He was failure. He was an abysmal failure in El Salvador. Two failed places for the U.S. government. Gun violent, murderous, butcher whites. So next we talked about, so we're going to just review a few points. Duarte, Washington kept sending military aid to Duarte despite his mass murder campaign, his human rights abuses, his racist slaughter that the U.S. government was funding with their helicopters, weapons, military personnel, all of it. They were bombing guerrillas. They were bombing their own people. Innumerable deaths and colossal destruction by the U.S. gun violent, murderous, mafia butchers. The guerrillas, but the guerrillas didn't stop. They continued to go. Human Rights State Department report, a fraud. It's a fraud. The U.S. press are frauds. It's a deceitful liar group of white racist, murderous frauds, liars and frauds that lie and deceive the people, deceive the world of their vicious campaigns and pretend that everything is going smoothly when it is a murderous campaign, a brutality by the U.S., murderous, gun violent, racist butchers. So we went through that. We continued with the national, international human rights organizations against El Salvador, the paramilitary violence. Amnesty International pointed out that murders, tortures, and disappearances were now selective, carried out against those who opposed the government. These crimes were not investigated and the perpetrators were not brought to justice. On the anniversary of the assassination of Romero, a large demonstration in El Salvador demanded trials and convictions of the assassins. 6 years after the crime, these people were still at large. Again, the government, didn't do anything. They said everything. We're going to send, descriptions. We're going to send review of the, assassinations. Total failure. U.S. government, again, lies and deceitful frauds. So continuing on, the war, Reagan wouldn't let the war in El Salvador end. Basically, he was unable to, improve the situation. Duarte was unable to improve the situation. It stayed afloat only with economic aid from the United States. They made it a murder colony of the U.S., a murder dependency. We call it a murder dependency when you have to murder people for the sake of money. Okay, that's a murder dependency. So U.S. government, again, another murder dependency of its racist, murderous white butchers. And that's what they ended up being. It was mired in misery and war throughout Reagan's term. The real weight of the economic crisis fell on the poorest classes. 6 of 7, 10 Salvadorans were unemployed, and prices of consumer products were well out of the reach of most people. So again, the racist, gun-violent, murderous American mafia butchers, the white butchers, the criminal butchers of the United States, conducted this campaign. So we started with, basically Grenada. Let's talk about Grenada, the invasion of Grenada. Pretty nasty thing. We already talked about press fraud, deceit and fraud by the white press of the U.S., the gun violent press and its racist, murderous butcher government work in tandem. Noam Chomsky has multiple books about the tandem workings of the U.S. deceitful, lying press, and that is shown in Grenada. So let's talk about why the press was lying. So basically, Maurice Bishop, said that Reagan was going to invade. Basically, on October 25th, 1983, the invasion was announced in advance by Reagan. Maurice Bishop said he denounced it before the world, that peril was hanging before the island. The American press dismissed Bishop's fear as paranoia. Again, the U.S. government, racist butchers, and their, deceitful, lying, fraud propagandist press said that, Bishop had nothing to worry about. Well, then what happened? U.S. invaded Grenada. They saw the reason for the invasion. The press didn't discuss this, and the U.S. government doesn't talk about it, but it was because they were doing excellent. The country was improving. He had broadened the health and education sectors. He sought popular participation through mass organizations. He promoted the unionization of the working class, introduced social education to bring gender equality in the workplace. Economic growth in 1982 was 5.5%, compared with 1.1% on the neighboring islands, and the private sector increased by 10%. Washington couldn't stand any of this. They pretended that Cubans and Soviet Union were, they whipped up a paranoid anti-communist hysteria. Again, the racist, murderous butchers of the U.S. government with an anti-communist or anti-third world hysteria they whip up for their gun-violent machine gun government of butchers, white butchers of the U.S. government. So the Cuban engineers and the Cubans were helping, the doctors and the engineers were helping put the airport together. This didn't satisfy Reagan. He was jealous of the progress of Grenada. He thought it was a black country. The U.S. government are racist butchers. It's a black country. And so, the racist butchers of the U.S. government had to invade it and slaughter the people. They made it into a whorehouse. We saw that, they basically made it into a whorehouse. It was, venereal disease was, rampant. There was rampant venereal disease and prostitution. For third world people, the U.S. government believes that they are prostitutes, drug addicts, or, basically just, assassins, murderers. They have to be prostitutes, drug addicts, or murderers. That is the gun-violent American government. Butchers, racist, international butchers. And then we talked also about the invasion being uniformly, condemned. All of the United Nations groups, everyone condemned this invasion. The U.S. gun-violent, murderous mafia butchers did a mass murder campaign, and everyone condemned it. The Cuba, recorded that it was the invasion was, not improvised, premeditated aggression by Washington. Cuba called it. The whole United Nations Security Council, not the Security Council, the General Assembly, because the U.S. murderous butchers sit on the Security Council, so they veto any legislation that restricts their racist rights of aggression. They are gun-violent, murderous American whites. And so basically 11 nations voted in favor of the resolution condemning the invasion. And the United States vetoed the resolution in the UN Security Council anyway. But it was endorsed because the only 11 nations voted in favor of it. And then the General Assembly adopted a resolution with 108 in favor, 9 against. The United States and the Caribbean countries that participated voted against, and 27 abstained. Most of the 6-3 speakers condemned the United States for violating international law and clear principles on which relations of the civilized worlds are based. The U.S. are uncivilized, racist, murderous butchers. That's what the ultimate thing is. So we said Reagan was a failed presidency. It was a failed presidency. His wars were a failure. The U.S. government is an abysmal failure. It created mass slavery, mass torture, mass murder. That is their standard thing. They are racist, gun violent, murderous, mafia butchers. Okay, continuing on. Panama, dead man walking. Autopsy of the invasion. The lost decade for Latin America, the 1980s, ended with the brutal United States invasion of Panama at dawn while its people slept on December 20th, 1989, with a massive air, sea, and land operation. Somewhere between 20,000 and 27,000 soldiers, varying numbers were cited, occupied the small country of only 2 million inhabitants. This was the theater of war saturation of the rapid deployment strategy. The United States' declared objective was to capture General Manuel Antonio Noriega, accused of drug trafficking, to bring him before a court of justice and to restore Panamanian democracy. The undeclared objective, however, has to do with the status of the canal treaties, which forced the United States to dismantle its military bases and leave the country before the year 2000, which it was loath to do. It needed to place the government in power that it could manipulate to change the treaties. In the midst of the bombardments, the destruction, the massacres, the panic, and the humiliation of the Panamanian people, a most unusual ceremony took place at the American military base of Fort Clayton. The chief of the United States Southern Command installed Guillermo Endara as the new president of the Republic. Operation Just Cause, the code name given for the invasion by the Pentagon, was the most extensive military action undertaken by the United States since the Vietnam War. The United States justified it as an act of legitimate defense. The superpowers attacked on a small third world country called forth feelings of indignation and consternation. Once again, the world could see that no matter who was in the White House, respect for the principles of international law was nothing more than rhetoric. In contrast, to the relaxation of the world tensions promoted by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, which Ronald Reagan joined with one foot in the stirrup and one eye on history, the act of war cast a new post-Cold War reality into relief. The Soviet Union, without its Eastern European allies and in the process of internal disintegration, was no longer the superpower confronting the United States in the international arena. The United States had the world firmly in hand and made all the rules. A pact with the devil. Ever since Theodore Roosevelt's unforgettable I took Panama in the 1902, its secession from Colombia provoked by the United States, Panama had been subject to United States dominance. Roosevelt built the canal between the two oceans, and in the treaties he signed by the recently installed Panamanian government, the United States acquired perpetual dominion over a strip of land 10 miles wide and stretching areas across the country, and the right to intervene in Panama's internal affairs. These rights were included in its first constitution. The imperial eagle extended its sheltering wings and its claws over the new republic, which it converted into a quasi-colony. The Colombian historian Eduardo Lemaitre called the invasion a disaster and described Panama's tragic reality. The Panamanians still have to believe that. From the moment they separated from Colombia under the protection of the North American Shield to create what they believed would be an absolutely sovereign nation, they sold their country's soul to the devil. For it is materially impossible that a people can enjoy such prerogatives of independence and sovereignty when its territory is divided by a zone where a gigantic power has so many and such vital interests. Panama paid for its independence with part of its territory and compromised its sovereignty and its identity as the nation. With this foreign enclave in the middle of its territory and subject to constant United States interference, the Panamanian people grew under the syndrome of United States domination with the complex of their powerlessness governed by a white minority. 90% of the population is black, mulatto, or mestizo, subjected to the military, tied to foreign capital, and allied unconditionally with Washington. General and President Omar Torrijos, 1968 to 78, changed these rules, but only for a short time. United States interference, electoral fraud, and changes in government at the whims of strongmen, always legitimized by the Legislative Assembly and recognized by Washington, were constant in Panama's political history. The invasion was a part of this history. The strongman. Torrijos was not the first Panamanian strongman, and his government was not a military dictatorship as the United States claimed. The first was Antonio Ramon Quintero, a police commander who in 1948 grasped the baton of political power as a result of unusual electoral developments. He was the first to run the country from the barracks, presiding over the president. In 1952, he was elected president. After his death, there occurred a succession of strongmen. Torrijos was one of them who made an unmade president. This continued until General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Upon Torrijos' death, Noriega, the chief of an army intelligence, assumed the command of the National Guard in a Machiavellian move plotted with the military command. Like the others, he began to manipulate the presidents from the barracks. Noriega had Washington's support. He had been on the CIA's payroll for three decades as an informant. He also provided information to the payroll he also had provided information to the Pentagon and the National Security Council during the 1970s. Noriega was a principal asset of the new and dominant CIA station in Panama City. Panama was the United States political and military spy center for the entire continent. This canal zone held 14 United States naval and air bases and the School of the Americas, though in the 1980s, President Jorge Elweka evicted it from Panama, where the military and police officers from all over Latin America achieved military training on counterinsurgency techniques and anti-communist ideologic indoctrination. Noriega received an instruction at this school. Washington had long known that Noriega was given intelligence information on the United States to the Cuban government, but his services to the CIA and other intelligence organizations were more important. In April 1976, Carter's CIA director, Stansfield Turner, discovered that Noriega had infiltrated its networks and promptly took him off the payroll. The Southern Command Singing Serpent, supposedly a Puerto Rican, sold Noriega the transcription of telephone conversations of members of the government, the army, and Panamanian politicians intercepted by United States intelligence services. The businesses continued and spread wide. 2 or 3 American soldiers sold him classified material with the complete plan for the United States electronic surveillance, quote unquote, of the entire southern continent, as well as the National Security Agency's secret technical manuals with the list of intercepted telephone numbers in all its countries. The CIA did not punish the canneries in exchange for this collaboration in assessing the extent of the damage. Reagan wedding out Noriega. According to some, relations between the United States and Noriega began to deteriorate in September 1985 when he removed President Nicolas Ardita Barletta, a former high World Bank official, and installed in his place Vice President Eric Arturo Del Valle. He ousted Barletta for having named a commission to investigate the assassination of Hugo Spadafora, of which Noriega was accused of being the architect. Spadafora, the former Contra under the command of Eden Pastora, was a prominent figure of the opposition and one of those first to accuse Noriega of drug trafficking. His body turned up, headless, and brutally tortured at the Costa Rican border. Noriega's version of the events was different. He insisted that relations had begun to go downhill after National Security Advisor Admiral John Poindexter came to Panama in December 1985 to ask Noriega to have the Panamanian Defense Forces take part in an invasion of Nicaragua, and he declined. He explained that Poindexter had threatened him and warned him that he had better to think of the consequences. According to Noriega, this was why the United States launched a campaign to discredit him. Noriega's version was confirmed by the Miami Herald, citing official American sources. The newspaper reported Poindexter and Noriega had spoken about the Nicaraguan situation with Poindexter asking for Panama's support for the Contras and that Noriega had refused. Ambassador Everett Briggs, who was present at the meeting, claimed that the topic had not been touched upon. He further explained that in a long and painful meeting, Poindexter had humiliated Noriega in front of his subordinates by mentioning the existing suspicions about his relations with drug traffic and arms dealing and laundering of dollars in Panama. The New York Times and NBC television network reported these stories to coincide with Noriega's visit to the United States in June 1986, claiming that he had developed illicit activities while he was chief of Army Intelligence, a post he had held for 13 years, and he continued them as commander-in-chief of the Defense Forces. They also mentioned the suspicion against him regarding the assassination of Spadafora and the intelligence information he passed to the Cuban government. In July, the United States House of Representatives made the same accusations. The New York Times commented that the State Department was surprised at these accusations and ordered an investigation. The Washington Office of Latin America maintained that this information had been fed to the media by Elliot Abrams, a high State Department official with Poindexter's authorization. This relentless press harassment precipitated Noriega's return to Panama. He immediately met with his advisors in the presidential palace and jokingly dismissed the importance of the accusation. These are matters of gringos and wannabe gringeros, who were plotting against me, he declared. In a letter, the United Nations Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar, President Eric Arturo Del Valle accused the United States of this orchestrated campaign to pressure and discredit Panamanian authorities, in which the United States Congress and press took part in order to destabilize Panama. He averred that the accusations were calumnies and of anonymous origin based on supposed secret sources on the claims of functionaries who had not to be identified. He pointed out that this moment chosen for these accusations happened to coincide with the campaign by some Americans to prevent the fulfillment of the Panama Canal Treaty's terms. Opinion within the Reagan administration was divided. The White House, the State Department, encouraged by Elliot Abrams in Congress, wanted to destroy Noriega, but CIA Director William Casey, the Pentagon, and Vice President and former CIA Director George Bush believed that Noriega was extremely useful and praised his intelligence work highly. They did not want to create a conflict in the midst of the extensive clandestine operation managed by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to sustain Reagan's secret war against Nicaragua behind the backs of Congress and United States public opinion. The CIA gave Noriega $11 million to buy arms for the Contras. He did not want this transaction to be known and warned that he would suspend the operation immediately if it became public. The Iran-Contra investigation documented that Noriega offered Poindexter and North a deal. He would have the Sandinista leaders assassinated if Washington would clean up his image and left the embargo on arms for the Panamanian Defense Forces. The United States did not accept because the law prohibited any United States government involvement in assassinations, quote unquote, prohibited, quote unquote. The United States Drug Enforcement Agency knew about Noriega's connections with drug traffic, but needed his collaboration to control the flow of drugs in Panama, the main transit point for drugs en route to the United States and a center for money laundering, as well as for arms dealers. In a letter to Noriega, the DA wrote that his cooperation was effective and valuable. The American journalist Alexander Cockburn pointed out the double standard. While the DA was praising Noriega, the White House assistant Norman Bailey claimed that it had a 21-cannon barrage of evidence that Noriega was a drug trafficker. The Panamanians knew that we knew, claimed the former member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and according to the American journalist Seymour Hersh, the public was convinced that Washington contributed to the creation of one of the biggest thugs of recent times. The crisis begins. In the middle of 1987, Panama was an oasis of peace and prosperity in comparison with the convulsive situation of its Central American neighbors. President Del Valle was the visible figurehead of the government, while the supposedly invisible head of government was Noriega, the commander of the Defense Forces, the calm to turn stormy in June when retired Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, a first cousin to Torrijos, accused Noriega of corruption on a grand scale, electoral fraud in 1984, and complicity in the assassination of Spadafora and the death of General Torrijos. The accusations coming from the man who, until 3 days earlier, had been second in command in the army, led to the most serious political crisis in Panama's history. Diaz Herrera returned with interest to the blow Noriega had gave that forced him to retire from the army and prevented his rise to the top of the command of the defense forces, had been agreed and for which post he had been in line. In August, Diaz Herrera was arrested, and in depositions to the Attorney General, he retracted his words. He stated that he lacked proof, especially about the drug trafficking. The day after Diaz Herrera's accusations, the people took the streets to demand Noriega's resignation, the dismissal of the military officers accused of corruption, an investigation of the denunciations made against them, and a return to democracy. The mob blocked the main roads with barricades and burning tires and provoked confrontations with the police. The city was paralyzed. The opposition formed the Civic Crusade. More than 40 businesses, committees, and associations, professional people, and students. It was supported by the Catholic Church hierarchy. This was a middle and upper class movement. No sectors of the lower classes were represented. Known on the streets as Nabid Blancos, white asses. The crusade called for civil disobedience, and thousands of people took to the street blowing whistles, banging on pots and pans, and blowing their automobile horns to demand Noriega resignation. School, banks, and businesses shut their doors. After 3 days of protest with scores of wounded and arrested, the government decreed a state of emergency and suspended constitutional guarantees, freedom of expression, movement, and assembly, habeas corpus, and the inviolability of the home, and imposed censorship. Del Valle held Diaz Herrera and external forces responsible for the disturbances. On the other side of the barricade, the Southern Command put its 10,000 soldiers on a state of alert. In June, the United States Senate adopted by an overwhelming majority of 86 to 2 million a resolution strongly criticizing the Panamanian government and the country's defense forces. It asked that Noriega and other officials accused of drug trafficking be ordered to resign or retire until the results of the investigations were known, and called on the government to restore constitutional guarantees and hold free and fair elections, quote unquote. President Del Valle called this resolution an inconceivable, intolerable, and unacceptable intervention into Panama's internal affairs. The high military command issued a virulent statement against the United States, stating that the Senate had become a center of political conspiracies against Panama. The Panamanian chancellor sent a notice of protest to Washington and recalled Panama's ambassador. The Legislative Assembly found that the resolution offensive declared by the United States Ambassador Arthur Davis persona non grata and demanded his immediate recall. So that was Congress, the racist Congress. More than 15,000 people protested outside the United States Embassy, shouting anti-Yankee slogans. Those brutes in the Senate think we are their cattle. Southern Command out, Yankee go home. Davis out, Davis or Noriega. Stones and pots of red paint were thrown at the diplomatic headquarters. Washington closed its consulate in Panama, cut military and economic aid some $14 million, and suspended the sugar quota. It also presented a protest in the most energetic terms to the government because of the attack on its embassy, in which, so it said, the government participated in violations of international obligations to protect protect diplomatic missions. It demanded that Panama pay the cost of the damage to the embassy. Panama took its complaint to the OAS, accusing the United States Senate of meddling in its internal affairs and requesting strict compliance with the Canal treaties. The resolution was adopted by 17 votes to 1. United States, 8 abstentions, Costa Rica, Honduras, Haiti, and the small islands of the Eastern Caribbean. 4 countries were absent, and Paraguay did not participate. The protest against Noriega and Del Valle continued for more than a month. Thousands of people dressed in white, a symbol of the opposition, and waving handkerchiefs took to the streets to demand free elections and Noriega's resignation. The crowds were violently broken up by the special anti-riot forces, the so-called Dobermans, with more than a score wounded and hundreds arrested. Noriega's followers organized demonstrations of support, and anti-Yankee demonstrators threw stones at the American businesses and banks. The office of the Daily La Prensa, which accused Noriega of state terrorism, was burned. Entrepreneurs and businessmen organized shutdowns to protest the destruction of their businesses and shops. Some banks closed their doors in fear of vandalism. The university called off classes after the Doberman shot at students and wounded 40. Business and luxury boutiques were looted and some were destroyed. Looting and armed robberies were extended to private residences as well. The city was militarized and the government prohibited public demonstrations. 3 days later, thousands of people dressed in white took to the streets again. About 150 demonstrators were wounded and 300 were arrested in battles with the Dobermans. The opposition protested this official violence. Del Valle ordered a general amnesty for those arrested in the disturbances against the government. On July 11th, the ceremony on the anniversary of Trujillo's death, attended by Del Valle, Noriega, the High Military Command, and more than 100,000 people, the military officers, called for the people to unite in peace and express their vigorous condemnation of foreign interference in their internal affairs. On the eve of the planned anti-government demonstration on August 5th, 6 well-known businessmen, leaders of the opposition, were arrested. The government claimed that a raid of the Chambers of Commerce, headquarters of the Civic Crusade, which by this point boasted a membership of more than 100 political, business, and professional organizations, had turned up a plan to overthrow Del Valle, to dissolve the Legislative Assembly, and to hand power to a civilian junta. They were released 2 days later. In November 1987, Del Valle announced to Washington that Panama would not participate in joint military maneuvers planned for January and ordered officials of the United States Agency for International Development out of their country. The Legislative Assembly approved the government's decision to suspend the visas of United States military personnel. Rumors ran strife through Panama. There was talk of Noriega's possible resignation, of conspiracies and coups against him being forged in Washington and Panama, and of secret organizations by Noriega with United States emissaries to find an honorable way for him to step down. In October, Newsweek reported that Jose Blandon, Panama's consul general in New York and confidant of Noriega, delivered a plan to restore complete democracy in Panama to Elliot Abrams, Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs. He let him know that Noriega agreed. The plan foresaw Noriega's retirement for the command of the Defense Forces on April 1988 and new elections in 1989. As a quid pro quo, it asked immunity for Noriega from cases brought against him in Panamanian courts and those in United States courts, and an explicit guarantee by Reagan that these cases would not continue. Noriega asked Blandon in a cable dated December 1987 and quoted by Newsweek not to lose strict control of the document and the discussion, since he did not want to appear like the Japanese surrendering on the decks of the Missouri. He made it clear that he did not want to leave Panama, but if he must, he retained the right to return whenever he wanted. He said that he would only leave his country in a coffin. At the end of January 1988, Noriega rejected a plan and fired Blandon. He said it was said he did so because he knew that Blandon was consulting with Del Valle behind his back. Washington believed that the deterioration of the economic situation and the slowly but surely growing discontent in Panama will lead to the defense forces to topple Noriega. Abrams claimed that the general was hanging on by his fingernails. Several times he mentioned the date for his fall, but Noriega did not fall, and the crisis intensified. An orgy of vendettas. The accusation filed by federal courts in Tampa and Miami that Noriega was involved in drug trafficking were based on testimony by convicted drug traffickers. United States citizen Michael Kalish and Panamanian Floyd Carlton Solares. The Justice Department offered to reduce their sentences and other privileges in exchange for their collaborators. In other words, they would finger Noriega. The system of buying witnesses is an operating procedure in the United States justice system. Still, the justice system was worried about the scant credibility of such testimonies. In February 1988, the parade of Noriega's enemies and former friends began, accusing him before the courts, at congressional investigation committees, and in the press. It was a vendetta party by people who had some reason to bear a grudge against him, among them General Diaz Herrera over the cause of his disgrace, and Colonel Ruben Darlos Paredes, whom Noriega had advised to give up his command and launch a campaign for the presidency. According to one report, for Paredes to do this was like jumping from an airplane without a parachute. Paredes accused Noriega of having killed Paredes' son. Another of his accusers was Blandon, the former consul in New York, whom Noriega had demoted. Stripped of diplomatic immunity, he implicated Noriega before a Miami grand jury and a Senate subcommittee of having connections with the narcos, receiving $1 million bribe and allowing the laundering of dollars, and having ordered Sabatafora's murder. He described Noriega as a businessman who would soon sell weapons to the Sandinistas as to the Contras or the Salvadoran guerrillas. He alleged that money drove Noriega relations with the CIA and the Cuban government. Blandon became a key player for Washington since he also implicated Fidel Castro in drug dealing. Blandon and his family were placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Blandon claimed that Noriega had conspired with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the major figure in the Iran-Contra scandal, but spoiled a plot of North's to send weapons to the Salvadoran guerrillas, which North wanted to accuse the Sandinista government of arming the FMLN. Noriega helped to dispatch the shipment. It came from the German Democratic Republic, but later had intercepted it, and the operation subsequently went away. Blandon claimed that in 1984, he had accompanied Noriega to Havana and had been present in a meeting with Castro. He showed photographs and averred that he had 75 hours of taped conversations. According to him, the meeting had been intended to resolve a dispute between Noriega and Medellin cartel, since Noriega ordered one of the cartel's cocaine laboratories in Panama's Darien province to be destroyed. He swore Fidel mediated the dispute. He also claimed that Bush had called Noriega at the start of the Grenada's invasion to ask him to warn Castro not to intervene. Bush denied this. Blandon's torrent of accusations, none accompanied by evidence, moved Democratic Senator John Kerry, the chairman of the Senate Investigations Committee, to beg him to restrain himself. In his book on Noriega, New York Times journalist John Dinges wrote that after many months of investigation and interviewing the swarm of people involved in the Noriega case, he had come to the conclusion that many of the accusations were impossible to confirm and others were unlikely or clearly false. He pointed out inconsistencies, confusion of dates and facts, data that did not agree with the testimony, and the fact that almost the entire legal case against Noriega was based on the testimony and convicted drug traffickers. Dinges quoted Captain Felipe Camargo, a former member of the Panamanian Defense Forces, arrested after the invasion, who was present at the meeting in Havana and who swore Blandon's version of the events was a distortion of the facts. Ramon Milan Rodriguez, a virulently anti-communist Cuban-American complicated in the Iran-Contra scandal, the brains behind the dollar laundering network, and other criminal subtleties in the field of drug traffic, was among Noriega's victims. He was a convicted criminal. He's paying with a 45-year-old prison sentence for money laundering and extortion, and became another of Noriega's accusers. Before the Senate subcommittee, he claimed that in 1979, Noriega agreed to launder money in Panama, and then 4 years later, he abruptly broke the agreement and reported Milan to United States authorities. Milan had been arrested. Now I am returning the blow. And if you want to call this a personal vendetta, fine with me. He retestified that he had helped set up $4.6 million commission from the Medellin cartel for Noriega to allow the shipment of the United States of 4,000 pounds of cocaine and 1 million pounds of marijuana. The investigator preparing the case against the Noriega for the Miami district attorney rejected Milan's accusation in totally lacking in credibility. Floyd Carlin Caceres, the Panamanian who had once served as Noriega's private plot, came to the committee with a face covered by black hood. He declared before the Senate subcommittee that the Medellin cartel had offered Noriega $30,000 to allow it to land into planes in Panama, at which the general laughed and asked if they thought he was a beggar. He says that in this way, Noriega received $100,000 for the first flight and $150,000 or $200,000 for later ones. Noriega's firm demand to Reagan's emissaries, they wanted him to resign and leave Panama, was for the United States to drop the cases against him and grant him immunity from prosecution. The reply from the high White House, State Department, Justice Department, and DEA officials remained the same. Not possible, no way, can't be done. While the United States administration, Congress, Congress and media furthered this intense moralistic campaign against Noriega. The drug trafficker and the Justice Department rounded up and tampered with witnesses. Accusations about drug traffic in Central America, implicating the CIA and the DAA, came to light in the hearings of the Senate committee investigation of the Iran-Contra scandal, which erupted in 1986. Several sources corroborated them. The American pilot Gary Betzner and Colombia immigrant Jorge Morales, both serving time for drug trafficking in a federal prison in Miami, testified in several separate interrogations that they had carried contraband cocaine with the help of these agencies. They declared that CIA planes carried weapons to the Contras and returned to the United States loaded with cocaine. Both agencies denied such accusations. Members of this congressional committee also confirmed that the network supplying the Contras with arms introduced drugs into the United States with the aid of the United States intelligence services and the Central American countries. Milan, in turn, maintained that the money from drug sales was used to support the Contras. He admitted that he laundered money and facilitated the transfer of funds. And in October 1988, Newsweek reported that the Contras bought weapons from the profits from the sale of cocaine they had brought into the United States with the help of the CIA and the DEA. Excuse me. The New York Times revealed that a DEA affiliate in Guatemala had confirmed the existence of such a connection, and that Washington Post reported that Jorge Ochoa, one of the principal Colombian drug lords, was involved in supplying arms and Contras transporting cocaine from Central America to the United States. That same month, news agencies reported that federal agents were investigating 40 United States banks supposedly implicated in money laundering operations. So let's, make some comments. We're talking about Panama. So the first thing we want to talk about is, basically, Nicaragua. Poindexter, the American National Security Advisor in December 1985, visited Panama and spoke to Noriega. He wanted Noriega to invade Nicaragua. He wanted him to attack the Sandinistas. Without doing so, he said very clearly that, basically, it wouldn't go well. There would be consequences. Poindexter told Noriega there would be consequences if you refuse to attack Nicaragua. This is racist American butchery. This is deceitful fraud and lies. Did the U.S. government ever admit to this? No, because they are racist frauds, liars, and propagandists, deceivers, and American mafia racist butchers. So continuing on, we went over to, the Senate. Okay, so we talked about, the accusations of the Senate. The Senate basically, was attacking Noriega. All right, the Senate, the New York Times commented that the State Department was surprised of the accusations and ordered an investigation. Basically Poindexter's authorization was given. The relentless press harassment precipitated Noriega's return to Panama. He was, harassed by the U.S. press. He immediately met with his advisors in the presidential palace, jokingly dismissed the importance of the accusations. These are the matters of gringos. These are Americans and wannabe Americans, gringeros, who are plotting against me. In a letter, the UN Secretary General accused the United States of an orchestrated campaign to pressure and discredit Panamanian authorities, in which the United States Congress and press took part to destabilize Panama. So you can see the racist mafia, U.S. Senate, the racist mafia parliament. This is a mafia state. This is not a parliament. This is a mafia state. You discredited Panama. You are racist, murderous white butchers. Racist, murderous white butchers. They, conspired with the press, the U.S. Congress and the press, conspired together to discredit Panama and destabilize Panama. This is what the U.S. government does secretly in Latin America and all around the world. They secretly destabilize through coordinated campaigns of propaganda, lies, deceit, and secretive murder. That's the U.S. government's whole story. So basically, we talked about, the Congress and the Senate, conspiring together, basically Noriega's, Blandon. We talked about congressional investigation committees. Noriega's enemies, joined the story Blandon. He was a liar. He was a fraud. We talked about the fraud liar of Blandon, who went through and described all of the different accusations. He was, taped conversations with Fidel Castro. All of it was lies. None of it was, truthful. And, it was caught. But, ultimately, this is what the racist white murderous butchers do. They fabricate, they falsify, and they pretend they're, good people. They're racist, gun violent, murderous white butchers. And then finally, we talked about drug trafficking, right? Drug trafficking. The notorious drug trafficking charge by the U.S. Justice Department, its DEA, and its gun violent administration. It's all a fraud. They used to take arms to the Contras in Honduras and come back with a plane packed with cocaine. That is stated by American troops. This is, Gary Betzner, American pilot, and Colombian immigrant Jorge Morales, who were serving time for drug trafficking, testified, in separate interrogations that they had carried contraband cocaine with the help of these agencies. They brought cocaine back from, the Contras in Honduras back to the United States, filled with cocaine to give to people in the United States. So while the United States administration, Congress, and media furthered the intense moralistic campaign against Noriega, moralistic butchery, deceitful lies morality is the U.S. government's approach. The drug trafficker and the Justice Department rounded up and tampered with witnesses. Accusations about drug trafficking in Central America implicating the CIA and DEA came to light in hearings of the Senate committee investigating of the Iran-Contra scandal. Several sources corroborated these. These are all documented evidence of American, drug trafficking, American bringing back drugs for the sake of making money and, loading in drugs into the United States so that they can keep the, Hispanics and blacks here, filled up with drugs. That is what the third world gets. Drugs, prostitution, and murder. They are gun violent American racist white butchers. So let's continue the itinerary of a fiasco. We're destroying Panama to free the Panamanians from Noriega. High State Department official commented seriously. The measures Reagan took to bring him down shook the Panamanian banking sector, one of the Latin America's most important, but not the general. The climate of instability and mistrust accelerated capital flight and response to withdrawals. The 120 banks, most of them Americans, only 14 were Panamanians, lacked currency. On several occasions, they closed their doors to prevent withdrawals. In March 1988, the Panamanian foreign debt was $2 billion and debt service went up to $82 million. The disruption of the economy affected mainly the poor and salaried workers. The fiscal crisis and the government's lack of currency prevented the payment of wages owed to 140,000 public servants and 15,000 members of the defense forces. The government had no recourse to the issuance of currency, an option open to all other countries, since its currency was the dollar, issued by the United States Federal Reserve. So I'm going to take a short break. Give me 1 minute. I'm glad you could join us today. Be right back. Okay, we're going to, keep going. We got another 19 pages left. The Panamanians were desperate because of the difficult economic situation and feared United States military intervention. They saw its invasion of Grenada, its threats against Nicaragua, and its frequent maneuvers in the Caribbean as a prelude to its intervention in Panama. Anti-Yankee sentiment was evident, not only among the people, but also in important sectors of the Panamanian commerce, since they were suffering from economic sanctions imposed by the United States in an effort to topple Noriega. The militaristic display and threat of an invasion of Panama alarmed the rest of the southern continent as well. In 1988, former President Alfonso Lopez of Colombia, Carlos Andre Perez of Venezuela, and Daniel Oduber of Costa Rica, it was with their help that Torrijos had achieved the new canal treaties in 1977, went to Panama to try to convince Noriega to resign. They warned him that remaining in power would not benefit him, Panama, or Latin America. Venezuela and Spain offered him asylum. They told him that military intervention by the United States would ruin the agreements on the canal and become a threat to all their countries. Noriega agreed to resign in a few months and to speak to the opposition to fix a date for elections. They left Panama convinced they had won Noriega over. 4 days later, Del Valle went to Miami for a meeting with Elliott Abrams, who called, "From whom?" question mark. From this meeting emerged the decision to remove Noriega from office. Jorge Eduardo Ritter, a former Panamanian chancellor, said that Abrams pressured Del Valle to do it. Others said he only agreed to do what he had already decided to do. When he returned to Panama on February 25th, Del Valle announced the general's dismissal in a 10-minute television speech, secretly pre-recorded. With the support of the military command, Noriega called an urgent meeting of the Legislative Assembly. In the early morning, also in 10 minutes, the Assembly dismissed Del Valle and the Vice President and named the Minister of Education, Manuel Solis Palma, provisional president, all with a unanimous vote by the 38 legislators present. The Assembly total was 67. After this bombshell, Del Valle remained isolated. The night before, he had taken his family to the United States ambassador residence, having no contact with the outside world since his phone lines were cut. The following day, he disappeared. It was said he was in some secure place in Panama or hiding and at a United States military base under the protection of the Southern Command. Reagan was surprised by the Panamanian people's disinterested reaction to Del Valle's dismissal. He had been hoping for massive popular protest, waiting to Noriega's fall. He did not seem to understand that for Panamanians and for the opposition, Del Valle was no more than Noriega's puppet, and that the product of fraud, and that the repeated charge changes at Las Garzas Palace, the presidential palace engineered by strongmen, did not exactly make them lose sleep. No one, it seemed, was eager to risk anything for politicians. The only support Del Valle could count on was from the United States Embassy. The Rio Group meeting at Cartagena, Colombia, decided to suspend Panama, one of its members, and recall their ambassadors for consultations. Mexico did not join in this gesture. Reagan, profoundly annoyed, warned that he recognized only Del Valle as the constitutional president of Panama. It was a grotesque display of the cynicism with which the American administrations have used Panamanian presidents, attributing to them a non-existent legitimacy and granting them recognition that as humiliating as it is laughable, commented former Panamanian Chancellor Ritter. Washington was aware that in the question of legality and illegality, Del Valle and Solis were on an equal footing. Both came to the presidency by the decision of the strongmen. Del Valle fell by the will of Noriega, as had Arturo Barletta from Del Valle had no problem replacing. Reagan did not mind Del Valle's presidency was the result of a fraud, nor that he was disposed in the usual Panamanian manner, a system to which Washington never objected. His interests in Panama were different. Reagan recognized Del Valle in order to use him, and Del Valle allowed him to do so. To the world, his presidency exercise from hiding somewhere in the United States territory might have been grotesque, but for Panama, it was ill-fated. The United States used it to ruin Panama. On the instructions of President Del Valle, the State Department froze $50 million of the Panamanian government money on deposit in the United States banks. It also suspended payments of $6.5 million owed Panama under the terms of the canal treaties, prohibited United States enterprises in Panama from paying taxes to the Panamanian government, and suspended trade preferences, which affected $96 million worth of trade. Del Valle, in his turn, ordered Panamanian consulates to keep the funds they received from shipping companies and registered their ships in Panama, a business arrangement that brought the country many millions of dollars. The leaders of the Civic Crusade called a generalized strike. Some banks, large part of the commercial sector, restaurants, gas stations, and commercial and professional offices closed their doors. Taxi and bus transportation dropped. Small groups of demonstrators threw up barricades, burned tires, and fought with the police. But the absence of opposition leaders was conspicuous. The crusade lifted the strike on the fourth day because the Chamber of Commerce did not want it to interfere with its annual fair. One public employee observed, "They are businessmen, and they run the country like a business from Monday to Friday, and on the weekend they go to the beach. You can't make a revolution that way." The social and economic situation was critical. Strikes and protest demonstrations demanding the payment of wages became an everyday occurrence. The government handed out checks it could not cover and bonuses no one wanted. Food and basic necessities were becoming scarce. There were strikes by some 140,000 public employees, chain stores, gas stations, doctors, and teachers, and marches by 60,000 retired people. Commerce and industry were paralyzed by the strike of stevedoras in Balboa. They were demanding complete payment of their wages in cash. This is not political, claimed the striker. Noriega is not the object. It is a question of workers' rights, the feeding our children, no pay, no work, simple as that. The army broke up the strike. On March 16th, there was an attempted coup against Noriega by a small group of officers led by Leonidas Macias, chief of the National Police. Newsweek called it a comic opera since the conspirators trapped themselves when they closed the door by accident and were arrested. A few minutes later, Noriega appeared on the steps of Army headquarters, smiling and sarcastically answering questions of reporters. With the exchange of fire inside the barracks, the news of the attempted coup spread like wildfire. Some rumored that Noriega had fallen. A violent mob from the popular neighborhoods attacked commercial centers, set fire to warehouses, burned cars, and stoned the police and the army. Telephone and utility company employees cut services. The army took over these businesses and started them up again. The anti-riot forces moved into action. They broke into the Marriott Hotel, where the opposition press conference was taking place, and arrested 20 of the opposition leaders and 12 journalists, among them 5 United States nationals. Several were beaten. The government declared a state of siege and closed 3 newspapers, 3 radio networks, and a television station, and the army broke up the stevedoras strike, which had spread to other places. Noriega took advantage of the situation to clean out the army and police ranks and establish his friends and families in key positions. More than 100 officers, most of the police and the intelligence services, were arrested and placed under investigation. Panama accused the United States of instituting this coup. The Pentagon declared that it was kept informed but took no part. Abrams, sure of the outcome, announced, as he had on other occasions, that Noriega would fall in a matter of days. In spite of the coup's failure, Washington saw it as a positive sign, since it revealed the divisions within the defense forces and the police had become sharper. It had faith that the military would topple Noriega. The last tango. Panama was bombarded with threatening news from Washington. Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams announced that the administration was studying new measures to squeeze the Panamanian economy, and if the general remains in power after Easter, it would seek new formulas. One of these, according to a high official, was his forced extradition, a benign euphemism for the abduction of foreigners from other countries. Washington was trying to break Noriega and the defense forces' resistance and create confusion and desperation among the people by its military maneuvers in the Caribbean and the state of alert activities of the troops of the Southern Command. The Panamanian government protested the maneuvers by the Southern Command since they violated the canal treaties under whose terms Panama would be notified beforehand, which had not been done. The Southern Command responded that it was conducting routine exercises. The tension continued to rise because of the continual incidents, real and provoked, between the military forces and elements of both countries. Washington now intended to internationalize the conflict. It presented Panama as a security threat to the United States and Latin America. It maintained that Noriega was stockpiling a large quantity of Soviet weapons from Cuba, as reported by 2 Panamanian officers in the United States, deserters from the Air Force. National Security Advisor General Colin Powell said that perhaps Noriega was trying to establish some sort of insurgency for the time being when he was no longer in power, but that the most worrisome thing was the infusion of Soviet and Cuban weapons to destabilize Central America. At the end of March 1988, the United States Senate unanimously adopted a strong resolution in which declared that the agitation of Panama posed an unusual and extraordinary threat to the American national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States, and urged Reagan to increase the economic, political, and diplomatic pressures against Noriega. With such support, Reagan was free to intervene in legitimate defense, quote unquote. The State Department asked for an increase in the number of troops in Panama. The Pentagon sent 1,300 Marines and 26 planes and helicopters. It also ordered the return of the families of its diplomatic personnel to the United States and cut its embassy staff in half. News agencies reported constant meetings at the White House on the Panamanian situation to study the possible solutions to using force. A State Department official announced that such an offensive was used to pressure the Panamanian government and raise the morale of the civic crusade. Reagan's policies in Panama were a fiasco. In April 1988, the economy began to show favorable signs. The three largest supermarkets and other high-volume sales outlets opened their doors, closed for 10 days, and several American corporations, among them Eastern Airlines and Texaco, ignored Reagan's restrictions and paid some $3 million in taxes to the Panamanian government. Vice President Bush, who had just declared his presidency, made an unexpected change. He claimed that the millions of dollars going into Panamanian banks were sent by Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. Reporters asked where Bush got this information. White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater claimed that it was from intelligence sources he could not reveal, and it was a sign of, quote, the White House conclusion that Libya's relations with Noriega. In other words, the relations of a terrorist with a drug trafficker. The United States Embassy in Panama denied any information on the subject. When Gaddafi heard Bush's remarks, he declared that he supported his candidacy because no president could be as demented as Reagan. The president of Mexico, Miguel de la Madrid, remarked that no country could claim a monopoly on truth in politics, nor could democracy be imposed from abroad. Carlos Andre Perez, the former Venezuelan president who was running again for office, agreed that United States meddling complicated the situation, and it had unfortunately turned Noriega into an anti-imperialist and nationalist leader and a defeat of Latin American sovereignty. At a meeting of the the Latin American Economic System, CILAL, in Caracas in April, a unanimous vote, including the representative from the Chilean military dictatorship, called the United States policy against Panama coercive, and CILAL showed its willingness to provide economic aid to counteract their efforts. No United States head of state had ever managed to create a greater continent-wide consensus against his policies than Reagan. For Reagan, the ridicule to which Noriega had submitted him was humiliating. His demands and the failures of his emissaries had been too public. Each time he offered more without ever succeeding. First, he set a date for Noriega's resignation. Later, he promised not to seek extradition if he went to another country. Then he said he could stay in Panama if he resigned. Each emissary was given the same reply by Noriega. The United States should drop the cases against him. Their response was the same. No way. In the election year and the final months of his term, Reagan could not permit a failure in Panama. He was already loaded down with the enormous Iran-Contra scandal and the failure of his policies in Central America. He was subject to bitter attacks from the Democratic candidates Michael Dukakis and Reverend Jesse Jackson, and from members of his own party who were afraid that they would lose the election. Washington offered Noriega another deal. It would stop court cases against him if he left Panama. When the press revealed that Reagan was disposed to negotiate the question of immunity to Noriega, the Justice Department and the DEA protested, and the administration retracted its offer. In May, to prevent the negotiations entirely, the Senate adopted a resolution by a crushing majority prohibiting any negotiations that implied the cessation of the cases against Noriega. A summit meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev was planned for the same month in Moscow, and Reagan, president of the world superpower, could not arrive carrying this load of failures. Without allowing the congressional resolution and the opposition of the Justice Department and the DEA to stand in his way, he opted to negotiate with Noriega and offered to drop the court cases against him if he resigned and left Panama. Secretary of State Schultz again sent this high State Department official Michael Kozak to Panama with this message. He had gone there on secret missions previously. Kozak even proposed to Noriega the possibility of returning to Panama to celebrate Christmas with his family. In the meantime, the United States kept military harassment and psychological warfare at a fever pitch. Reagan and Schultz were convinced that this mission would be a success. Noriega could not refuse because he would be getting what he had always wanted. His withdrawal from Panama was the solution to the crisis. Schultz, who was supposed to accompany the president to Moscow, postponed his departure, hoping to bring good news. Abram once again announced the imminent fall of the general. Kozak did his job and made his generous offer, but again, Noriega did not accept. Profoundly depressed, Schultz informed the nation of this new failure. It meant the collapse of negotiation with Noriega. Reagan received the news in Helsinki, Finland, on his way to Moscow. There, a journalist asked him if he thought the United States looked like an idiot in the face of Panama. "I don't think so," answered the president, but everyone else did, including many inside his own administration, noted Time, referring to this brief exchange. The politics of force espoused by the State Department was not shared by those in charge of defense. The Pentagon publicly stated that confrontation would not succeed. A council measured inadequate steps to achieve the government's objective. Anonymous sources in the Pentagon leaked what they themselves called an idiotic State Department plan to kidnap Noriega. Abrams declared that such comments were irresponsible and dangerous. The public quarrels between the Departments of State and Defense on the Panama issue revealed that the government was entangled in a round of blind man's bluff. It was not the first time such a situation had happened, but it was the first time they aired their differences in public. The situation turned sinister, commented a high State Department official. Noriega was not toppling, and the possibilities for ousting him were running out. There was fear that Panama and throughout the continent of the United States military intervention because of Noriega's blind intransigence in refusing to retire. On 3 occasions in 1988 and 1989, Lopez Michelson and Carlos Andres Perez attempted to convince him that this game against great power was dangerous and that the only way out was for him to resign. Their intention, commented Lopez in an interview with the Colombian magazine Semana in 1991, was to maintain neutrality of the canal, ensure that the United States complied strictly with the Torres-Carter treaties, and avoid a United States military intervention. What happened later we had foreseen, he added. The 9 members of the Panamanian Conference of Bishops also asked Noriega to resign to avoid more suffering among the people, and Archbishop Marcos Gregorio McGrath offered to mediate. Costa Rican President Oscar Arias and Spain's Prime Minister Felipe Gonzalez asked the Archbishop to accompany them to convince Noriega the danger that was hanging over Panama. To their surprise, the Archbishop told them that he had consulted the leaders of the opposition, and they told him that the State Department had asked them not to get involved. The Civic Crusade was Washington's tool. The CIA funded it, and the State Department gave it political orientation to prevent it from reaching an agreement with Noriega. The crusade called for a national work stoppage. Some 75% of the commerce and industry shut its doors, and the streets were empty. The people reappeared on August 10th to receive the body of Arnulfo Arias, 3 times president of 3 times deposed, who had died in Miami. Arias had been the harsh critic of Noriega. 100,000 people went to the airport, and the funeral became a loud protest against Noriega. Arnulfo Presidente, Noriega delinquente, Arnulfo President, Noriega criminal, shouted the people. The incidents and friction between United States uniformed and civilian personnel and Panamanians were becoming ever more frequent and intense. Washington charged that its military personnel and their dependents were subject to kidnapping, rape, beatings, and extortion by Panamanians, and warned that it would do whatever was necessary to protect them. The Panamanian government accused the United States of meddling in its internal affairs, violations of its airspace and territory, and endangering the lives of its citizens with low-level flights by airplanes and helicopters over its military installations. La Estrella and Critica, 2 Panamanian newspapers, listed more than 70 United States violations of the canal treaties. In September 1988, the United States Embassy circulated a document communicating its government decision not to comply with the canal treaties as long as the process of democratization in Panama had not been certified. In other words, a change of government and Noriega's departure. Not even a miracle could save Reagan from his failure in Panama before he left the White House, but he needed to show that he was still working to bring Noriega down. The media reported his constant meetings with Secretary of State and Defense George Shultz and Frank Carlucci, and with National Security Advisor Colin Powell to analyze the Panamanian situation. They announced new measures and new dispatches of troops, weapons, and war materials to the Southern Command. Government spokespeople talked of the possibility of an invasion and the abduction of Noriega. The government did not know what to do in this conflict. In January 1985, Reagan left the White House and Noriega remained in place. he had succeeded in getting rid of Del Valle without any protest. The two attempted coups against him had failed, and he had cleaned out the colonels and generals without creating conflicts within the defense forces. Now it was George Bush's turn to get around this crisis without having any better options to resolve it. Mr. Bush goes to war. To many, George Bush's administration would be the 4 more years that Reagan wanted to govern, but the Constitution wouldn't allow. His feeble political character grew in the shadow of the most popular United States head of state since Franklin Roosevelt. Bush's candidacy held sway in the Republican Party, not because he was the best candidate, but because Reagan supported it. Bush was Reagan's heir apparent. There were few opportunities for negotiating in the Panama crisis after Noriega's rejection of the biggest concession the United States could offer him, forgetting about the court cases against him if he left the country. This had been a humiliating process for the great power, and the possible threat of force became more apparent. Bush did not openly tackle the Panama question. It was a delicate affair that could have put him in an embarrassing situation. Noriega had been a longtime CIA informant, and Bush, according to the former CIA director Stansfield Turner, put him on his payroll during his term as CIA director. During the presidential campaign, journalists inquired about his relations with Noriega while he had been CIA director and Reagan's czar. Bush, a paradigm of ambiguity, did not answer. The Panama crisis was a heavy load for the new head of state. A month after his inauguration, he approved a CIA plan to oust Noriega. Bush personally pressured Congress to approve $10 million to start the operation. The money was intended to support the Panamanian opposition and encourage a coup. Rumors ran rife of plans for the United States or Panamanian commandos to kidnap Noriega. The information published in the magazine U.S. News and World Report was not denied by the administration. Panama's economic situation improved in spite of the sanctions imposed by Washington. Commerce functioned on a barter system and discounts initiated by business leaders, and money returned to the bank vaults. According to Newsweek, the official sources in Washington confirmed that this recovery was due to an infusion of $20 million in credits from the president of Libya and from West German and Asian banks. These sources neglected to mention the $565 million Washington deposited in the same banks to pay its military personnel in Panama and the Canal Commission. But the real source of the Panamanian bank's recovery, the one everyone suspected without being able to prove, was the money laundering from narcotics operation. With these funds, it was claimed that in January 1989, Noriega founded the Banco International Institutional Bank of the Homeland, a private entity belonging to the Defense Forces Welfare Fund, which controlled as president of the junta. Its headquarters were near the general headquarters of the Defense Forces, where he had his command post. The bullseye, Noriega. Panama prepared to hold elections in May 1989, and the campaign grew heated. Civic Crusade leaders Guillermo Endara, who had been secretary to the 3-time president Arnulfo Arias, Ricardo Arias Calderon, head of the Christian Democratic Party, the major electoral force in Panama, and Guillermo Ford of the Molinera Party all had presidential acquisitions, although their guns were turned off primarily on Noriega and Carlos Duque, a businessman and an official candidate and leader of the Democratic Revolutionary Party, founded by Torrijos. They had still attacked one another. The battle among the opposition candidates worried Washington. Its ambassador was given the job of convincing them to come together and support Endara as their presidential candidate. Arias and Ford were to be vice presidents. They agreed to this arrangement. The sector supporting the government comprised the Coalition, National Liberation Coalition, Colina, with the Democratic Revolutionary Party and 7 small parties. Duque was its presidential candidate, and Roman Sierra, Noriega's brother-in-law, and Aquilino Boyd, Torrijos' former chancellor, ran for the vice presidential post. Colina counted on the government's political machinery, the support of the defense forces, even though they were not all of one mind, and a favorable press. The government had shut down the opposition press, El Siglo, La Prensa, and Extra, and the television and radio stations were opposed to Colina. It could also count on the Dignity Battalions, a civilian armed front, and shock troops created by Noriega for defense against the United States aggression. For the first time, Panamanian society was divided, with its political forces popularized not by internal problems but by the conflict between Noriega and the United States. The opposition's priority was to normalize relations with Washington and persuade it to suspend the sanctions and end the isolation it imposed on Panama. Not for a moment did it question Washington's aggressive and provocative acts, nor its violation of the Canal Treaties. Its attacks on Noriega were the cause of the crisis. Duke's banners were nationalist and anti-imperialist. For Colina, the important issue was Panama's future, threatened by the United States, the defense of its sovereignty, and the fulfillment of the Canal Treaties to ensure that the United States military enclave in its country be dismantled. Its slogans emphasized that the choice was between a free and sovereign nation or being a United States colony if it voted for Endara, whom Colina accused of having sold out to Washington. The people welcomed Duke's opposition to United States intervention and his defense of the Canal Treaties, but his prestige was diminished for being Noriega's candidate. Simplistically, national and international public opinion saw that support for Duke was to defend Noriega, and to defend Noriega was to be a drug trafficker. Washington's strategy was to delegitimize the government and discredit the election before the people of Panama and in international public opinion to convince them that Noriega was setting up a massive fraud in Duke's favor. This was a psychological campaign run by the United States experts. President Bush and Secretary of State Jane Baker warned that they would not recognize the president who kept Noriega in a position of power. Bush continued the strong economic sanctions since they were legal according to Washington. They were in response to the request of the constitutional president, Eric Arturo Del Valle. Bush ratcheted up military harassment, the gradual increase in the number of troops at the United States bases in Panama, and with more frequent and threatening maneuvers in the Caribbean. Although his spokesman stressed that military action was a last resort, the danger of an intervention was more evident every day. Many people in Panama and the United States wanted just that in order to be free of Noriega. Washington's candidate, Endara, was not in favor of such intervention and stated publicly that he preferred to swallow a few more years of Noriega. We can get rid of him, even though it may cost us blood. He noted the United States officials had assured him that military intervention was absolutely inconceivable. The refusal by the opposition leaders to negotiate with the government and Noriega's refusal to abandon power closed off the possibility for a political solution and opened the doors to United States intervention. The fear existed in Panama and abroad. Several former heads of state in Latin America continued to try to convince Noriega of the necessity for his resignation and the danger of such intervention. His confrontation with the United States was absurd. Spain and Venezuela repeated their offers of asylum. So I'm going to just make a few comments. We're discussing Panama. Okay, we're discussing Panama. We're talking about, we talked, most of the Panama. But, the more important thing was at the end of March 1988, the United States unanimously adopted a strong resolution. The Senate, the mafia American parliament, the mafia parliament of criminal murderers adopted a resolution, quote unquote, and declared agitation in Panama posed an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States, and urged Reagan to increase economic, political, and diplomatic pressures against Noriega. So with such support, Reagan was free to intervene in legitimate defense, which he did not do so. He was a failure. Reagan was a failure. He was not able to do anything. Then we got into George Bush. Okay, we wanted to talk about George Bush. Mr. Bush came into the office. This is a Ku Klux Klan racist American. This is, a failure president. George Bush, again, used the Panama crisis. He basically, used CIA Director Statsfield Turner and approved a plan to oust Noriega. He approved the CIA plan to oust Noriega. The racist, murderous butcher George Bush approved the CIA plan to oust Noriega. Panama's economic situation was, improved in spite of the sanctions that United States, imposed. So basically, Washington became agitated that, their economic war on Noriega and Panama was not working. Again, the U.S. government, gun-violent, racist, murderous white butchers, caused, a invasion of Noriega and an invasion of Panama as a result of, the vicious campaign. And then, all of George Bush's actions. He was, again, a miserable failure president. George Sr. was a racist, murderous butcher and a miserable failure as president. His failed intervention in Panama, as well as his failed war in Iraq, were both examples of a racist, murderous white American butcher. Another, beacon of stupidity and beacon of racist butchery of the U.S. government. So let's continue. We said Washington, okay, Bush continued the strong economic sanctions since they were legal, according to Washington. They were in response to the request of the constitutional president, Eric Arturo Delvalle. Bush ratcheted up military harassment with a gradual increase in the number of troops at United States bases in Panama, with more frequent threatening maneuvers in the Caribbean. Although his spokesman stressed that military action was a last resort, the danger of an intervention was evident more every day. Many people in Panama and the United States wanted that in order to be free of Noriega. So Washington's candidate Endara was not in favor of such intervention and stated publicly that he preferred to swallow a few more years of Noriega. We can get rid of him even though it may cost us blood. He noted that United States officials had assured him that military intervention was absolutely inconceivable. The refusal by the opposition leaders to negotiate with the government and Noriega's refusal to abandon power closed off the possibility of a political solution and opened the doors to United States intervention. The fear existed in Panama and abroad. Several former heads of state in Latin America continued to try to convince Noriega of the necessity for his resignation and the danger of such an intervention. His confrontation with the United States was absurd. Spain and Venezuela repeated their offers of asylum. Governing from the United States territory, Del Valle offered to talk with Noriega, but Noriega refused the offer. Del Valle had no credibility with the Panamanian government or with the opposition to the government and to the people. He was no more than Washington's puppet. The greater the United States interference, the stiffer were the controls Noriega established to counter it. In April, a month before the elections, he suspended a tourist cards for the United States citizens, a device in force for more than 50 years. They would not now have to apply for visas at Panamanian consulates. Nevertheless, this restriction was easy to circumvent because entering Panama from the United States military bases with or without a visa was simply a matter of a short walk. The same month, the Panamanian intelligence services dismantled a clandestine radio and television network set up by the CIA with sophisticated equipment. Its agent, Kurt Muse, who was arrested in this operation, revealed that the operation was meant to destabilize the country, create chaos, and stimulate popular insurgency against Noriega. It was to begin in the first week of May, and the videos were already set. Muse was freed by the invading troops in an operation at the prison that killed the Panamanian guards, in which many criminals escaped. Newsweek reported that Noriega's aptitude in manipulating psychological warfare techniques was admired by sectors of the United States military. It was claimed that he had learned them in the military's own training centers and that now he was using them against the United States. Noriega's reaction to the increased military harassment was at once defensive and provocative, but just short of a major provocation. The approach prevented his moves from becoming major incidents. He keeps us off balance, chasing our tails distracted, a military spokesman said. In April 1989, the Panamanian government requested an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council to denounce aggressive United States harassment, its flagrant intervention of Panamanian internal affairs, and the latent threat of a military action against its country. The intervention, said Panamanian Chancellor Ritter, was to establish a government subject to Washington, renegotiate the canal treaties, and maintain its military presence in Panama after the year 2000. The United States representative to the United Nations, Thomas Pickering, denied these accusations. He stated there is no pressure or meddling. Panama's crisis was the result not of a conspiracy by his government, as the Panamanian chancellor claimed, but of Noriega's policies. He reiterated that Panama must hold free and impartial elections and that the government possessed information that allowed it to predict that the elections would not be clean. According to opinion polls, 80% of Panamanians opposed Noriega. Nevertheless, Washington and the Panamanians Opposition feared whatever the election results, Noriega would refuse to step down. Knowing the pool of Panamanian generals, Washington also recognized that whoever replaced him would be much worse. In the midst of the worst crises in its history and an atmosphere vitiated by open United States interference and military harassment, it became more intense, abusive, and threatening every day. The United States continued to harass, as well as subjected to severe economic sanctions. Panama prepared to hold the most important presidential election in its history. The race had less to do with the contest for the presidency than with the conflict between the United States and Noriega, in which the sovereignty and independence of Panama and the future of the canal treaties was at stake. The government established a series of controls to ensure that the process would not get out of hand. Magistrate Yolanda Police de Rodriguez, a solid ally of Noriega's, was the president of the Electoral Tribunal, which was certifying the voter returns. The former Colonel Diaz Herrera had accused her of electoral fraud in 1984, a tactic he claimed was planned in her home. A few days before the election, hundreds of foreign reporters arrived. The government imposed strict controls on their registration, places of residence, and journalistic activities. It prohibited press conferences not approved by the Chancellery and the broadcast of news interviews and reporting on the election contest. That did not come from the Electoral Press Center. It also strictly prohibited them from carrying the press card issued in an abuse of power by the Southern Command. Panama was also overrun with invited and uninvited observers, among them former United States Presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, who led an international group of 200. Others were sent by Bush without consulting the Panamanian government. United States Representative Robert Graham, Democrat, and Connie Mack, Republican, and Miami Mayor Xavier Suarez arrived without invitation or visa. They traveled in a military airplane that landed at Howard Air Force Base in the Old Canal Zone. They entered Panama without any incident. The foreign press and the Panamanian opposition accused the government of manipulating voter registration. They claimed that names of opposition voters disappeared while names of dead or fictitious voters were inscribed in their place, and that there had been changes in the locations of the voting booths to make access most difficult for the opposition. The governor denounced United States interference and its measures to strangle the economy in violation of international law and the canal treaties, and accused the opposition of having sold out to the United States by accepting the donation of $10 million to buy votes. In relation to Panama's small population, this was a fabulous sum. The day for Panama to hold the most controversial, dangerous for its own future, and corrupt elections in its history arrived on May 7th. Life is normal. The cities are plastered with posters. Everyone is out in the streets. There is no militarization. Businesses are open. Restaurants are full of people. Parties are at their headquarters attending to last-minute deals, wrote a Colombian correspondent. A high turnout was expected and a winning margin of 50,000 to 100,000 votes. Univision, one of the Spanish-language television networks that airs in the United States, predicted that 63% of the vote would be for the opposition and 24% for the government candidate. The voter turnout was massive, but no one could declare as a certainty that these elections had been free and clean. Voters were overwhelmed with an avalanche of pressure from both the United States and the Panamanian governments, and later it was said was pressuring public employees to vote for Duque. The following day, before there had been any official communication concerning the results, Panamanian Archbishop Marcos Gregorio McGrath announced to the foreign press that the opposition had won, with 74% of the vote to the government's 25%. He stated that he had these figures from the sampling carried out by the church at 115 polling places. There were 4,255 in all. These results became tantamount to quote-unquote revealed truth. Carter quoted them in claiming that Endara had won by a 3-1 margin, and the United States observers who had entered Panama illegally had confirmed upon their return to Miami that the Panamanian church and former President Carter claimed that Endara had won. The human rights, murderous, racist liar, fraud Carter. Noriega had stolen the election, Carter's pronouncement, issued after he had been prevented from verifying the recount being carried out by the National Scrutiny Committee, resonated throughout the world. Well-known United States and European election observers endorsed the thesis Bush had advanced months earlier that there had been massive electoral fraud in Panama. the members of Congress who had gone to Panama demanded the use of force against Noriega and the abrogation of the canal treaties if fraud was proven, which they took as a given. 3 days after the election ended, there were still no official reports on the results. Solis, Palma, and Noriega remained silent, but the international news agency AP, AFP, EFE, ANSA, and Reuters, racist, murderous, lie, deceitful propagandists of Reuters, ANSA, AP, Associated Press. These are lie propagandists broadcast to the world that the fraud of the century had been committed in Panama and denounced serious irregularities perpetrated by government and the defense forces, which presumed and threatened the people to make them vote for members of the military with their special identity cards could vote several times in different places. Electoral certificates were stolen and ballot boxes burned at gunpoint. The media pointed to members of the defense forces and the dignity battalions as the presumed authors of such acts, but many Panamanians were implicated. On May 10th, the National Security Committee released partial data. According to 15 certificates examined out of a total of 40, the majority had the official government candidate, Carlos Duque, winning 105,000 to 52,000. The city was under military rule, but some 5,000 people took the streets to protest outside the building that housed the electoral tribunal. Within a few hours, there were 80,000, said one correspondent. They were shouting slogans against the government and Noriega. This stuff is over because Endara won. Not another day. Endara is the president. Down with Noriega. We are going to mash pineapples into liquor. A reference to Noriega, who is known as Carapina, pineapple face, because of the acne scars on his face. The anti-riot forces and dignity battalions quelled the demonstrations with extreme violence. Endara received a head wound from a steel rod and was taken to a hospital. Ford was brutally beaten with sticks and sequestered in a hospital as a detainee. One of his bodyguards died. The image of his bloodied body facing a man attacking him with a steel rod was broadcast all over the world. Arias was mildly wounded. Several people with the scuffles were shot to death, among them Endara's bodyguards. Some 100 people were arrested and accused of attacking the nation's security. And the night of May 10th, after the day of violence that had resulted in 5 deaths and 23 wounded, Yolanda police read a statement over the radio and television transmitted every 15 minutes announcing that the elections had been voided at all levels, the presidency, parliament, and municipalities. She said that in the midst of the fiscal and economic crisis and the foreign media campaigns about fraud, numerous irregularities had been committed, among them the purchase of votes, the disappearance of ballots, and the lack of certificates. She denounced the evident intention of those who have come in the capacity of observers to further the thesis of electoral fraud proclaimed to the world by United States authorities since long before the election and the obstructionist actions of many foreigners called here by national and foreign political forces without benefit of an invitation. The proclamation of any candidate as a winner under such conditions is absolutely impossible. The decision, she said, was made after long meetings at the Republic's presidential offices and the participation of Solis Palma, his cabinet of ministers, General Noriega, and most of the high command. She made no mention of dates or plans for new elections. For several analysts, among them former Chancellor Ritter, the evidence for an overwhelming defeat of its official candidates determined this drastic decision by the government. Others spoke of the opposition's smashing victory. The annulment of the elections roused the ire of Washington hawks to dangerous levels. Congress and public opinion pressured Bush to order military action. The White House announced that the president, together with his advisors, was studying all possible options, both economic and military, with the goal of preparing a plot against Noriega. He was consulting with several governments of the region in order to take collective actions and force the general out. The next day, Bush summoned his ambassador and ordered the Pentagon to send 2,000 more soldiers and station the aircraft carrier USS America off the Panamanian coast to protect United States citizens from the violence that broke out after the elections had been annulled. He asked United States nationals to return home and United States businesses to move to other countries. We will not be intimidated by the bullying tactics, brutal they may be, of the dictator Noriega, declared Bush at the White House press conference. Washington spokesman insisted that the military action would be the last resort, but to Panamanians, it was clear that the intervention was already underway. Ritter remarked that Panama was not threatened by an invasion since it was already occupied country and it always had been. In order to take this extreme step, Bush was relying on support by the United States public and the Panamanian opposition, which included the most important economic sectors and oligarchy backed by the Catholic Church hierarchy. Bush spoke daily with Archbishop McGrath, who informed him that was what was happening in Panama. Many people, nationalists and patriots, were asking the United States to liberate them from Noriega, claimed the Panamanian sociologist Raul Weiss. But no one believed that the intervention would be so massive an act of war with the bombing of civilian population and an occupation of their country. As the constitutional president, Del Valle held a press conference at Washington's National Press Club to inform the press of the people of his government's policy in the face of the crisis, he declared that it will not discount any option, including the military one, for removing Noriega. He explained that he had discussed such measures with Bush, whom he had also asked to formally recognize Endera and the winning slate in the May elections. The annulment of the elections and the unbridled violence of the anti-riot brigades and the dignity battalions they had wounded all three opposition candidates caused a worldwide revolt against Noriega. President Alan Garcia of Peru, Carlos Salinas de Gortari of Mexico, and Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela expressed strong condemnation. Garcia warned that he would denounce and reject any manipulation of the Panama election results and any pressure of intervention from outside Latin America. Bush applauded the Peruvian president's declaration insofar as it condemned fraud, but he ignored his rejection of outside interference. The Rio Group, from which Panama had been suspended, in a joint statement dated May 10th, expressed its profound consternation about the events in Panama, since they could still further alienate the government from the Latin American democratic community. But it stated it was refraining from pronouncing judgment on the causal factors of the specific matters that determined, on the occasion of the election, the political crisis in Panama. Because of its absolute observance on the non-intervention principle, the statement reiterated the need for complete compliance with the canal treaties. Once again, Latin America tried to stem the United States military lack of control by clinging to the defense, rhetorical and utopian, of principles of non-intervention and free self-determination. In spite of the serious crisis, a few days later, Panama returned to the normal life within the context of abnormality. The streets which had been previously semi-deserted again filled with people, and the country returned to its routines. The markets, banks, and offices gradually resumed their activities, and supposed winning candidates are recovering from their bruises, said the Panamanian, amused themselves by watching the arrival of United States military aircraft with new units of soldiers without much excitement, wrote one Colombian correspondent. Panamanians explained that this lack of reaction in the face of a grave crisis as evidence of their pacifist nature. The Alianza Democrática Oposición Civilización, Democratic Alliance of the Civil Opposition, ADOC, as a political coalition, called for an open-ended general strike to begin on May 17, a date that coincided with the OAS Chancellor's meeting in Washington to deal with the Panamanian crisis. The strike called failed. The opposition blamed the languid response of the government's repression and the OAS in its labyrinth. 2 days after the announcement of elections in Venezuela, requested a meeting of the OAS consultative organ to take up the Panama crisis. Carlos Andres Perez noted the very serious matters were at stake, such as the future of the canal. The entire membership, including the United States and Panama, supported him, but Brazil, Chile, and Mexico expressed reservations about the OAS's incompetence to deal with the internal affairs of its member states, as in the case of Panamanian elections. To circumvent this difficulty, the matter under discussion was given an international favor. The 21st Consultative Organ meeting would study the Panamanian crisis in its international context. The meeting took place in Washington and began in May 17, 1989. Many feared that this would be a tortuous meeting because of the conflicting interests between the United States and the rest of the continent. The crisis superseded Panama's internal situation because of the open military and political intervention of the United States and the threat of an invasion, which everyone dreaded. The Chancellor's goal was to try to prevent this invasion, but no government was eager for a confrontation with the masters of the North over Panama. The Mexican government questioned Noriega's moral position in a statement, but declared it inadmissible that the OAS should be turned into the court of last resort for the electoral process of Latin American countries. President Julio Maria Sanguinetti of Uruguay and Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela expounded another thesis. Sanguinetti maintained that the principle of non-intervention has its limits, and Perez held that non-intervention was at times a form of intervention. In other words, the OAS had to act. The meeting began several hours late amid tensions and expectation. The debates were held behind closed doors. There was only one public session. The Hall of the Americas was packed with delegates and journalists. Within it were present the leaders of the Panamanian opposition brought by the State Department. The importance of the United States put on the meeting could be seen in the size and caliber of its delegation. It was said to be overwhelming, headed by Secretary of State James Baker. It was filled with State Department heavyweights and the government principal experts on Latin America. Bush actively consulted with some presidents to coordinate a diplomatic offensive and joint action in support of Panamanian democracy and to force Noriega to resign. With an avalanche of pressures on the presidents, delegations, and chancelleries of the member states, Washington sought to have the OAS approve concrete actions and drastic sanctions against Noriega, such as expelling Panama from the OAS, collecting, breaking off diplomatic relations, a measure supported by the United States and Chancellor Rodrigo Madrigal of Costa Rica and Ricardo Esveda of El Salvador, economic and commercial blockades, and the recognition of the victory of Andara in the May election. The United States had already done so. It did not succeed in any of these. The Panamanian Chancellor laid out United States aggression against his country in terms of the violation of principles of international law and the canal treaties, and denounced the economic sanctions as violations of the OAS and UN charters. He demanded that all the activities cease and warned of the dire consequences of military intervention in Panama to all of Latin America. Colombia Chancellor Julio Londano, who was chairing the meeting, rejected intervention in all of its forms in his opening remarks. We cannot accept that any country should attempt to constitute itself as the supreme arbiter of situations of another state, nor that it should be the supreme authority in deciding when an electoral process, abnormal as it might have been, shall be supported, and when a series of coercive and discriminatory measures of an economic character should be applied. The threat and use of force, he maintained, served only to unite the enemies of liberty and democracy. He rejected the amendment of the elections, but held that this crisis must be resolved by the Panamanian people alone. Venezuela, which appeared to have adopted the tough position opposing Noriega, circulated a draft of a resolution characterized as soft and extremely diplomatic, since it merely urged the member states to make gestures within their powers to find the solution to the Panamanian problem within scrupulous respect for the principle of non-intervention. It asked them to abstain from any action that might be contrary to these principles or incompatible with a peaceful and long-term solution of the problem. The seriousness of the internal situation in Panama and the disparities among the delegation's criteria led the chancellors to work out a consensus solution in advance. The formula proposed by 11 chancellors was the creation of a commission composed of Ecuador, Guatemala, and Trinidad and Tobago, and attended by the Secretary General of the OAS. It was to go to Panama to seek a national agreement and formula that would assure, within the mechanisms of democracy and in the shortest possible time, the transfer of power and full respect for the sovereign will of the Panamanian people. It further reiterated the defense of the non-intervention principle and the validity of the canal treaties. After an agitated closed-door debate, the United States succeeded in including a condemnation of Noriega in the resolution, though the majority opposed it, but the United States did not succeed in winning the strong condemnation it wanted. The one agreed upon read, the serious events initiated by General Manuel Antonio Noriega in the crisis and in Panama's electoral process could cause an intensification of violence with the consequent risk for international peace and security. Baker let it be known that the resolution adopted by the meeting did not meet the minimum demands of his government. Bush applauded the condemnation of Noriega and the demand for a transfer of power in Panama. The governments of Panama found the resolution acceptable since it succeeded in neutralizing the United States' attempts at manipulation. The Democratic Revolutionary Party, the party in power, stated that the OAS was short on ethics and respect for international law for attacking General Noriega in gross and contemptuous terms. Finally, the Panamanian opposition noted the condemnation of Noriega corresponded substantially to the expectations of the Panamanian people, but energetically objected to the OAS failure to recognize its victory in the May elections. Londano, the chair of the meeting, commented that the results were positive since they had avoided a stormy session and since a formula acceptable to the majority had been adopted. Between May 23rd and August 1st, the commission appointed by the OAS and headed by the Chancellor of Ecuador, Diego Cordova, a skilled diplomat and United Nations negotiator for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, made 4 visits to Panama. The commission warned in advance that did not attempt to intervene, but rather to build a bridge between the sides to find a solution to the crisis. Nevertheless, it always came up against the inflexible position of Endara, Arias, and Ford, who refused to negotiate with the government, insisting that their electoral victory had recognized that and that Noriega leave office. Noriega responded that he would talk to no one, for his was a matter to be solved by the government and the opposition, and that the military should stay out of it. The government warned that the question of Noriega's resignation was not on the table and that the primary issue was the cessation of aggression and sanctions against Panama by the racist United States. Cordova always concluded his reports by noting that nothing could be achieved because both parties were inflexible. The commission's term was extended twice by the chancellors, despite opposition by the United States, the Central American and Caribbean states, and the Panamanian opposition. The majority understood that failing to arrive at an agreement was opening the door to United States intervention. Faced with the impossibility of achieving a resolution reconciling the different positions, the chancellors decided that the final document would be a declaration by the chairman of the meeting, Londano Paredes. It was unanimously approved with no objections and in absolute silence. The declaration extended the commission mandate to August 23rd. Solis Palma's term ended the commission's mandate to August 23rd. Solis Palma's term ended on September 1st. It asked the Panamanian authorities to bring about the change of government by democratic means and in conformity with the current internal Panamanian procedures and hold new elections as soon as possible. And it outlined the topics they themselves proposed as the basis for dialogue. The unanimity on the content of the declaration was only superficial. The United States let it be known that it was not satisfied. Others found its language imprecise, since it mentioned the transfer of power without including a formula acceptable to all parties, asked the government to hold elections soon without specifying whether this date should be before or after September 1st, and did not mention Noriega, who could well remain exactly where he was. The Assistant Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, the United States representative of the OAS, quote, transfer of power meant that General Noriega must go. The result would mark the end of the crisis, and the Panamanian people would resume control of their own future. The Panamanian Chancellor Ritter, it meant finding a replacement for Solis Palma. To the opposition, transfer of power through quote unquote free elections meant leaving its electoral victory out of account. Arias said the declaration was ambiguous and contradictory, since the question was not whether or not there were elections, but whether or not Noriega would go. Again, he criticized the extension of the commander's terms, since this extension meant prolonging the suffering, repression, and impoverishment of the Panamanian people. Londano maintained that it was impossible to reconstruct the elections because of the loss of the ballot and the numerous ballots. He declared that although most Latin American countries, among them Colombia, expressed their disagreement with Panama's electoral process, no nation has recognized or is inclined to recognize that Endara won the elections and that therefore he should assume power. Noriega let it be known that if no agreement was reached by September 1st, the date set by the Constitution for the change of governments, a military junta would be formed. During the May to August deliberations of the OAS commissions, Solis Palma proposed to the opposition on several occasions that they form a national unity government together to save the country, but the opposition was always refused, insisting instead on demands recognition of its electoral victory and Noriega's ouster. In early August, the opposition suggested that the government hold a plebiscite so that the people could express their opinions of the formulas proposed in the OAS dialogue. The government issued a statement rejecting this proposal because the Panamanian Constitution neither contemplated nor regulated this sort of consultation. Cordova has insisted that it was impossible to arrive at a negotiated solution and that limiting the terms of his mission served no purpose. Londano again proposed extending his mandate to deal with the request by Panamanian political forces. Again, the United States and the Panamanian opposition were against it, and again the commission's term was extended. At the end of August, near the time when the consultative meeting would receive the fourth report from the commission, Salas's term would end the following week, and the government once more proposed forming a national union government to take office on September 1st and holding elections in 1 year's time. The opposition rejected the idea. Noriega commented that they were useful fools programmed to say no to everything since they had been offered a half share of the government, and with the great economic resource and support from the racist United States behind them, they could have had it all. Faced with the impossibility of finding a solution after 4 months of fruitless efforts, the chancellors held an informal meeting to hear new ideas. After 12 hours of anxious deliberations on 5 proposed revolutions, they were deadlocked. The way out of this impasse was once again to approve another of Londano's declarations in which he thanked the commission for its efforts, expressed profound concern at the party's failure to arrive at a solution to the crisis, reiterated that the solution was uniquely and exclusively the business of Panamanians, and exhorted the parties to make new and urgent efforts to arrive at the agreement before September 1st. That they never arrived at an agreement. Those who had this possibility with their power, who were conscious with the great danger hanging over Panama, did nothing to avert the enormous tragedy. And then we'll continue with the Rambos tomorrow, the racist American Rambos, murderous butchery of George Bush. So let's talk for a few minutes. So we said, we said the Associated Press, the foreign press, the AP, Reuters, ANSA, EFE, and AFP, all racist, liars, deceitful fraud liars, and, promoters of murderous third world butchery by the U.S. government, called the fraud of the century, had been committed in Panama, and denounced the serious irregularities perpetrated by the government and the defense forces, which pressured and threatened the people to make them vote for Duke. Duke won the election, and so, the U.S. government, of course, has to criticize the election. It is a group of racist frauds, murderous white butchers of the U.S. government, and that's what they did. They called press fraud. All of that stuff was discussed. We also talked about, the OAS, all of the different people. This was an internationally condemned intervention. Internationally condemned. The OAS was pretty strongly, unanimously condemning the U.S. aggression against the poor, small country of Panama. The United States military, was ready to invade. Economic warfare was trying to strangle Panama and, make a regime change. Again, another effect of subversion by the racist, murderous white butchers of the United States government. So the seriousness, we talked about the seriousness. All of the countries in the OAS said that, this needs to be resolved by, a general OAS dialogue, and a general OAS dialogue universally condemn this, this action by the U.S. government. Let's just, discuss it. The entire membership, including the United States, supported the Venezuela Carlos Perez Jimenez. Brazil, Chile, Mexico expressed OAS competence to deal with the internal affairs of its member states, as in the case of Panamanian elections. Many feared that this would be a tortuous meeting. The Mexican government questioned Noriega's moral position in a statement, but it declared it inadmissible that the OAS should turn into the court of last resort for an electoral process in Latin American countries. President Sanguinetti of Uruguay and Perez of Venezuela expounded that, principles of non-intervention has its limits. And Perez held that non-intervention was at times a form of intervention. In other words, the OAS had to act. Okay, so basically Bush actively consulted with presidents. That it was a big, money, cash, pushing flow to bribe. I'm sure there was a lot of bribery in this, Bush action. The racist white frauds of the U.S. government love to bribe their way to election success in third world lands in which they are not requested to be. Where is the United States business to be in Panama? They are racist, murderous, white butchers of the U.S. government. Okay, so the Panamanian chancellor laid out the United States aggression against his country in terms of violation of the principles of international law and the Canal Treaties, and denounced the economic sanctions as a violation of the OAS and UN charters. Again, the U.S. are gun violent thugs. They just, everything is, a garbage dump agreement. The racist whites of Washington consider every organization a garbage dump agreement, and that is what they end up being. It's all garbage dump agreement. Okay, and then Colombian Chancellor Londano made a wise statement. We cannot accept the United States as being the supreme arbiter of any other country, and nor should be the supreme authority in deciding when an electoral process, abnormal as it might have been, shall be supported, and when a series of coercive and discriminatory measures of an economic character be applied. So again, the U.S. government coming through as a racist, gun-violent group of whites trying to force election fraud, trying to bribe their way to election success in Panama, just so that they can vindicate Noriega, who they themselves are drug traffickers. The American government are drug traffickers. They traffic drugs from, Honduras back to the United States. And their own army people admit this fact. The American government and the U.S. murderous butchers are the drug traffickers. The United States government are the drug traffickers. And that's it for today. We did 55. We did like 60. Something like 62 pages. I'll be back tomorrow with another 58 to 62 pages. We will finish the book in 2 days. Glad you could join us. Masters of War, Latin America and U.S. Aggression from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years by Clara Neto. So let's just finish up with the closing comments. Again, the book link will be in the description section. Please download it. The murderous white American butchers Ronald Reagan, Alexander Haig, and Jean Kirkpatrick were discussed in their genocidal campaign against Latin America. The white murderous butchers conducted campaigns of terror, torture, rape, and mutilation in the countries of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and subverted the democratic leader of Costa Rica with police repression and terror. We discussed Nicaragua. The Sandinistas took power from Somoza in 1979. And as soon as coming to power, the U.S. elected the gun-violent, murderous white butcher Ronald Reagan to power. He was a Central American mass murderer and was responsible for the white butcher results in Nicaragua. He ordered the Contras, a terrorist organization funded by the U.S. congressional white butchers, to commit wide-scale murder, torture, rape, and bombings in Nicaragua against the Sandinista democratic government. The U.S. murderous white butchers, including Reagan, supplied hundreds and millions of dollars to the Contra to conduct a butcher campaign against the Hispanic people of Nicaragua. At first, Reagan painted this as a military operation. When one studies the actual results, one finds the Contras were responsible for murdering peasants and local murders and tortures, and did not do any successful action against the Sandinista military. The U.S. gun-violent murders white butcher Reagan and the U.S. mafia white murderous Congress hid the international outrage in Reagan's war of aggression against Nicaragua. There was no discussion about Reagan's criminal aggression against the Sandinistas, which was entrenched in American lies, deceit, and propaganda and murderous butchery. A few incidents deserve mention, including the Fantasma incidents, in which 35 teachers of the Sandinistas education program were brutally murdered by the Contras. Reagan called this a great act. We also talk about Reagan's militaristic obsession and his lack of interest in the diplomatic discussion with the Sandinistas. He absolutely refused all peaceful means to resolve the dispute of the Sandinistas, as is a common trait of the American white murderous butchers of the U.S. government. He was asked to accept the Contadora peace treaties established by multiple countries and endorsed by Mexico, in which terms of a ceasefire and contra halt to terrorism was denied. He refused after the Sandinistas accepted the Contadora proposal, and refused a peaceful solution because he is a gun-violent, white, murderous American butcher. The Roman Catholic murderous European fascist church, including its Pope John Paul II, criticized the Sandinista regime for its defense of its people and endorsed the American puppet archbishops, including Obanda and Vega, who were well connected with Washington's murderous war. This gave no room for the Sandinista of the Nicaraguan people to come to a peaceful settlement because of the gun-violent European and American white racist butchers. Reagan's war collapsed as the Contras were a failure. They were supposed to commit acts against the Sandinista military, but instead became obsessed with murdering Hispanic peasants, as any U.S. government-funded terrorist action ends up being. The Contras began peace negotiations, although the Sandinistas were very successful in derailing the Contra morale. The Sandinistas made great concessions with the Contras, and in 1988, and were ready to sign the Somoza Accords. Reagan was still in the White House and tried to sabotage Somoza with tirades against the Calero, the political leadership of the Contras, and over Costa Rican radio stations. He was enraged with signing of this agreement, and his domestic American thugs of Cuban exiles and Nicaraguan exiles bitterly campaigned against Somoza. The peace process was derailed by Reagan's bitter, white, racist, murderous deceit and lies, and propagandist harassment of the Contra political leadership. Next, we talked about El Salvador, which was Reagan's campaign of mass murder against the Salvadoran people. This was the FMLN, which was the Salvadoran rebels, fighting the ruthless dictatorship of Colonel Jaime Abdul Gutierrez, which was worse than Carter's human rights slaughter dictatorship of General Humberto Romero. There was mass murder, extermination of peasants, machine gunning of civilians, bombing of civilian areas and disappearances, and mutilations, including evisceration of bowel and amputations, as well as electrocution and drowning torture. This was all provided and funded by the U.S. Congress and Reagan. We remember Pierre Trudeau, the racist Canadian leader who backed Reagan in his war of Hispanic slaughter in El Salvador and had conversations in the Canadian presidential palace with Reagan. We also know of the international outrage against Reagan's brutal war against the El Salvadoran people and his funding received by U.S. Congress. Many international bodies condemned Reagan's war. Reagan, in total, is a white murderous butcher, American gun-violent butcher, and deceitful fraud liar the U.S. government had, and is associated with this racist U.S. Congress. So again, great job, Krishna Iyer with the Irish think tank in Delray Beach. Please join me again for 1 to 1.5 chapters, the next 55 to 60 pages. Have a great day.